Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chuck Timko with the U.S. Dairy Export Council. I am the current chairman of the U.S. Agricultural Export Development Council. I would like to welcome you to this first day of the USAEDC 2021 annual workshop. Though we had hoped to have this conference in person, unfortunately, circumstances have once again forced us to have another virtual conference. It is our expectation, however, that our 2022 Attaché Conference will be held in person in July 2022 in Tysons Corners, Virginia, and we hope to see all of you there. We have an interesting and varied lineup of speakers and panels over the next 2 days. However, before we start, there are, as usual, some housekeeping items and announcements that we need to cover. Firstly, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask questions of the speakers. Do not use the chat function. Use the chat function only to engage with other attendees, as well as to ask for technical assistance if necessary. Full speaker bios and the presentations can be found on the mobile app. A sincere thank you to our sponsors. This conference, there are 4: Euromonitor, Brian Christie, Trade Data Monitor, and Rose Research. Please visit the mobile app to find out more information about them and the services that they can provide to your organization. And something new this year, our event sponsors have also graciously donated some amazing gifts for us to raffle off during the meeting: wine, Bluetooth earbuds, 2 Apple Watches, and a Sonos smart speaker, whatever that is. I'm not high on this tech stuff. The drawings will be done throughout the conference, and you must be present to win. And the first drawing will be after our first presentation. With that done, we will now proceed to our first speaker, who you all know well. Jason Hafenmeister is the Acting Deputy Undersecretary for Trade and Foreign Agricultural Affairs and the Trade Council to the Secretary of the Department of Agriculture. Jason, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks, Chuck. This is Jason Hafenmeister speaking from the friendly confines of the USDA building. Thank you all for having me today and giving me a chance to share some thoughts. I'm going to share my screen here, so hold on. Who knows what will actually happen? So you should see a picture of a young and strong irrigator back when he had more tomorrows than yesterdays. So what I'll do is I'll just run through some ideas here, if I can. Not seeming to able to move my screen along. What are you guys seeing?
A blank screen.
Nothing yet.
Okay, well, clearly I'm doing it wrong. It says I am screen sharing.
Jason, may I share my screen on your behalf?
Yeah, go right ahead.
Thank you.
All right. All right, there it is. Okay, next slide, please. Next slide, please. So I want to talk about just a couple of things here. One, and these are very big conceptual questions, and I'm going to get at them because it's hard for me to talk about the administration's trade agenda because it's still under construction. So I want you to know we are definitely working on promoting exports. We are definitely addressing trade barriers where we find them. You know, we spend a lot of time working on Mexico, a lot of time working on China, Secretary's just been in Europe. We're suing the Canadians. We're working with Vietnam, just got some tariff reductions. So the work continues. I want you to be assured of that. And we are very clear on our mission here, which is trying to create more home for in foreign markets for US products. And we still very much believe in a rules-based market-oriented system is the way to do that. But in terms of big initiatives, the administration has been clear that first, what we're focusing on here is building back better, getting the domestic agenda through, and then there's going to be a pivot to more specific trade agendas. So stay tuned for all of that. Now, as we are preparing for that, here's some questions that I just am thinking about and wanted to share some thoughts with you. First is, what do we think about trade policy after the last 4 years? It's been a wild ride. Second, what can we think about as markets of interest for our sector, U.S. agriculture? We are very worried about institutions, and we're doing work on them. And then just some reflections on trade policy directions. Next slide, please. So this is, so let's talk about the gains from trade. And next slide, please. I just put up here a reminder for all the economists in the audience that there is such a thing as comparative advantage. There is such a thing as gains from trade. And this has been a long-standing truth that we have worked in agriculture to our advantage as competitive producers to find a home for our products overseas. So we know these truths about comparative advantage. We know the benefits of specialization. Next slide. We know that global integration supported by institutions like the WTO have led to tremendous improvements in living standards around the world. The human condition is no longer necessarily nasty, brutish, and short, as it has been for most of recorded history, but in fact, people are leading materially better lives. And US ag producers are beneficiaries because those are customers' workers. So we know that, and those are still verities. Next slide. And so here's our latest US ag export chart. You can see that we're going from a new record for FY21, and we'll see next week. We'll have a forecast come out for 22, and all things being equal, we can expect good results there. So the return to normalcy, I think, is paying benefits to our sector. Next slide. When I look at our ag export performance, I notice that we have these peaks, these spikes in our exports when we see high grain prices. Next slide, and next slide. And so those, then the next slide here shows, well, what does that show in terms of an overall trend? You can put the next slide down. Which tells me that when the times are good, when we've got the 7 fat years, we need to take advantage of them, because while the overall trend is upward, there's more down years than good years. And that's not a surprise to people in agriculture. You get the one profitable year and you lose the other 4. So we are above trend 1 year out of 4, I would say, overall, and that's where we are right now. Next slide. Now, that's where we come from, right? But we know that there's other views about trade. And in particular, we know that there's people who worry about our trade balances, is saying that justifies protectionism. And that is a fallacy. I'll remind everybody here that our trade balances are macro factors, that even as we have $800 billion trade deficits in goods, that is driven by the fact that the United States is a consuming, not a saving. We're a deficit country, not a surplus budgeting country, and we attract a lot of capital that we then turn around and import. So even when we have trade wars that put up barriers, it doesn't move our trade balance at all. Even when we export oil and gas instead of importing it, it doesn't check our trade balance at all. So I think that these issues are still around, and I think there's real limits to them. Next slide, please. And this is just a reminder that these deficits are puny when they look at the US economy. We have no trouble financing our deficits in this country, our trade deficit in this country yet. We are not a small country. Next slide. But there has been, but China is something different for us in terms of trade policy. There's been a lot of work on China shock. I recommend people study it. I've spent a lot of time looking at it, and the data is pretty strong. It's clear that the imports from China really were a different thing in our economy. They may have cost 1 million or 2 million manufacturing jobs. Now, in an economy of 135 million jobs, that's a big number, but it's not a crushing number. But what was interesting about imports from China was both the focus of imports, that this is the China shock. People look at commuting zones, and they found out that in certain zip codes, the unemployment effects from imports from China were both stronger and more durable. And where economists would predict that when you have imports driving out US production, you would have adjustments, that people would move to where jobs are. They'd take up new jobs, that we didn't really see that very smoothly in the China shock. And so that's driven a lot of our policy. And as China being such a big, important market for us, I think it's important for us to understand that there has been real suffering with China imports that we've never seen on anything else. But also, next slide is, I think that we're on the other side of the China shock. So this shows our imports from China, and you can see from 2013 on, China's peaked and then leveled off. And the next chart shows much the same thing. This shows market share, right? You can go ahead and show the next chart. So this shows China stealing a lot of share from Japan, principally, but also from Canada, but you can see how China has leveled off. The vast reservoir of low-priced labor in China seems to be depleted. China is now a much different competitor than it once was. Maybe took longer than it thought, and the effect was different on us than it was before. But to me, this says when we talk about policy with China, there's lots of things not to like about China in terms of human rights policy, in terms of environmental policy, in terms of competition policy, but I want to make sure that we have an up-to-date understanding of the competitive threat China has. Next slide. Next slide. I'll go through these quickly. I'm almost out of time already. So the other thing that we really need to focus on when we talk about what's different is that the effect on our sector of imports is also being felt in a way that is keen and we haven't felt before. Right? Specifically imports of horticultural products. That's the green bar there. You can see that our imports of other products are more or less flat, but a lot of fruits and vegetables come in. Next slide. And now, of course, we're big exporters of specialty crops, and a lot of this is counter-seasonal trade, but there is more competition. Next slide. And I think the next slide. The way that I like to illustrate it is by looking at the blueberry case. This got a lot of attention in the last years of the Trump administration. The ITC made a big investigation to see if there was injury in the US market because of imports, ultimately finding none. But what's so striking about this chart here is look at US production. That's in blue, right? In 1990, production was, less than half of what it is today. And so the demand for blueberries in the United States is going through the roof. Our producers are producing more than they ever have. But it's the imports that have really driven the increase, most of it being counter-cyclical, but it's those shoulder months, right? The end of the summer when imports are coming in and taking some market from US producers and definitely putting price competition that they haven't felt before. So this is something this is a challenge for our industry. I meet with import sensitive sectors a lot and tell them, we appreciate this. We want to see you succeed. Come to us with pro-competitive solutions. How can you compete better? I'm very nervous about anti-competitive solutions, things that are all about closing our market to imports. Let's find a pro-competitive solution. Next slide, please. Okay, next slide. Again, I'm going to go through these things quickly. So let's talk a little bit about, that's just a summary of some of the big trade policy questions that we are working our way through in the new Biden administration. Even as we have returned to normalcy, our exports have benefited from having markets open and more reliable. Good news on the steel front, good news on the Boeing front, and certainly other good news stories coming out where just the steady work of opening markets, I think, delivers benefits. But there are really big questions about what our trade policy will be. All right, so next slide is what do we do about markets of interest? So this chart here shows, we're very worried about our dependence on China. We felt in the trade war that when the China market was closed to us or tariffs went on, we really felt it. The $28 billion in payments that went out to try and mitigate the damage. Now, China is about 25% of our exports. Sometimes you make it sound like it's 50% because the market potential is there, but we have pretty reliable access to our FTA partners, and we do export to the rest of the world. But with that in mind, even as we're trying to maximize our performance in China under phase one and otherwise promoting our products there, we are looking at other markets. Next slide, please. And I am very struck by the fact that we are operating in a more competitive marketplace than ever before. This chart here shows total agricultural imports by importing country, excluding the United States. So these are the countries we export to. And you can see the growth, particularly of the Asian markets over time, where to 2010, we were competing in a $500 billion market. In 2019, we're competing in an $800 billion market. So that's good news. The pie is growing. More and more people are able to eat better all over the world, and that's good news for us. But it's a more competitive environment. You see that dotted line shows our market share has fallen. So as long as the pie keeps growing, I can live with declining market share. But if we revert to countries closing their borders, even as we have these new competitors in South America, the Black Sea, and elsewhere, that's really going to be a dangerous situation for us to be in. So how can we ensure that we keep the broadest range of markets open to our products? That's a priority for us. Next slide. So one way to think about that is through trade negotiations. And we look at bilateral negotiations, regional negotiations, WTO negotiations as still all important opportunities for us. This chart here shows regional negotiations. It shows that when countries first started negotiating outside of the WTO, they did it with their neighbors. This is 1975, and you can see each of those lines represent a bilateral trade agreement. So it's just countries integrating themselves with their neighbors. Next slide shows what this looked like in 1995, and you can see it was still largely regional trade agreements. The year we got the WTO, countries were mostly creating NAFTA or the EU or the Central America Common Market, these types of arrangements, very few outside of the regions. But if you go to current day, next slide, you can see everybody's negotiating with everybody. Like there's no discipline here at all. And people talk about the spaghetti bowl of trade agreements where there's just all sorts of different rules for different countries. And so this is not, this slide here is from 2014, but the trend has not changed. There is, the CPTPP is moving forward, and one of the primary candidates to join is the UK, right? So there's nothing regional about that. It's just people looking for commercial advantage. So we are worried about falling behind, and we do see opportunities to get new markets. And so having trade negotiations is something that we see help to diversify our product base, our customer base. Next slide. Now we look at our customers, right? Our top 6 markets care a lot for us. They're 60% of our sales. China's very dramatic here. Looks like we're back on trend with there. But the growth markets, next slide, are the developing country markets, right? These are the billion-dollar markets or more. We need a strategy that's going to address these countries. That's something that we are doing some thought on internally, but obviously it's a very complicated question within the administration. Next slide, please. Another way for us to open markets is to use the rules and enforce trade agreements. And so really what this chart here is trying to say is we haven't been doing that very much lately. In the last 4 years, really the only cases we took were ones to defend our steel and aluminum tariffs and our China tariffs, right? There was not a lot of offensive cases. And in fact, we had concerns about judicial activism in the WTO, and we disabled the appellate body mechanism there. So getting a policy together that enforces agreements when we find other countries that are acting unfairly and bringing them to justice certainly is going to be an opportunity for us to deal with unfair practices. And so, the administration is prosecuting the Canada dairy case. There's some quota rent issues about how those dairy quotas are operated under USMECA. So that's an encouraging sign. And I think the burden really is on us to find other cases where countries are violating the rules and see what we can do to prosecute them. Next slide, please. And then China itself is a market. You guys all know that. You're all very interested in it. Next slide. You know, our share suffered under the trade war. It's climbing back. Our overall exports are climbing back. You know, we definitely want to keep that market open. There's some things in phase one which are unfinished business. We want to hold China's to the fire on them, but there's always something new. I'm sure you're all aware of the 248, 249 regulations coming down. You know, we still face high tariffs on a number of products, ethanol and pork. We still have difficulty getting through the exclusion process, a number of specialty products and dairy. So there's plenty of work on China. Next slide. And so we are investing in institutions. We do see the existence of rules is a helpful thing, whether or not they're, certainly we want to apply the rule of law when it exists, but even the existence of a more general norm helps give us some leverage to go into other countries and say, hey, what you're doing is unjustified. It's not backed up by science. It's not backed up by trade agreements. It's not backed up on meeting the challenge we have in climate, and it's not helping you feed your people. The ability to point to independent authorities like other international institutions is critical for us to do that. So we've just gotten through a big Codex meeting. Some of you are aware of some of the European challenges there in terms of not recognizing science-based standards, but using other factors to try and block the adoption of standards. That's a big priority for us. And so we're staying on top of that. And we still have hopes of WTO, big WTO ministerial coming up in the next couple of weeks. You know, I'd like to see a refocused discussion there. Next chart. So I'm just going to make some final observations here. And again, I apologize. Very superficial conversation all over the place, but that's what you got. Next chart. So this is interesting. You know, this is a public opinion polling. This one is Gallup, but all the major pollsters find basically the same sort of thing, that trade is tough, right? In the 90s and the 2000s, we had 50-50 view on trade. It took all of our effort to squeeze through trade agreements through the Congress. 2016, so interestingly, coming out of the 2008 financial crisis, you know, trade, as usual, when the economy improves, people are a little more confident about trade. But then we have 2016, you know, where for the first time in my lifetime, trade really was a presidential issue. President Trump, you know, had very strong views on trade, really thought that we'd been taken advantage of, that America was a sucker on trade, and that he was going to pull us out of agreements and use bilateral leverage to fix it. And you saw this real amazing thing on all the public opinion charts about trade was more popular than ever. You don't fear what you're going to lose until it's lost. So now with President Biden in place, I think some of the Trump coloring of all this, you know, I think some of this may have been anti-Trump as much as pro-trade, is maybe reverting more to normal. But still, you know, there is a broad recognition that trade is important to the economy. We can't just walk away from foreign markets. So even going through the last 4 years, you know, I still think there is a strong residue of support for trade in this country. Next slide. You know, the fact that we can have rules that have an effect on our performance, I think is very important. I point to the cases of India and China, where they're very similar macro factors in these countries, 1 billion people, growing economies, agricultural production challenges. India has kept its markets closed, and it is a net exporter of ag products. China has opened to the world as much as the problems that exist there, and is now this giant market for ag products. You know, this is the kind of model we want to see adopted in India, in Africa, in Southeast Asia, and the rules-based system that opens to competition, we think is fundamental to that. Next chart. You know, there is a lot of talk about subsidies, right? And what this chart here shows, this talks about the US use of trade remedies, anti-dumping duties, countervailing duties. And it gets a lot of attention because this is one of the concerns about unfairness of trade. Like, we are unable to protect our market because the WTO has found against some of our anti-dumping countervailing duties. Well, what this tries to show is on the axis there, you can see what the share of our imports that are covered by trade remedies that are subject to dispute settlement. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6%, right? We can't lose fact of that there's 95% of the economy that is not being shielded by these measures. And we can't let these things, I think, drive our policy. Next slide. And one way to look at it too is steel. You know, we're fighting through some of the residues of the 232 policies. You know, there's good news out of Europe. Hopefully that will go elsewhere. And two observations about that. One is the US is a high price steel market, right? That blue line is the US price for steel. We are always more expensive than the rest of the world. And right now, of course, it's off the charts. And two is it's so interesting to see how we're negotiating these settlements of the 232s. We are working with other countries to address China, which is the source of all this surplus capacity. And we're going to incorporate climate considerations into what we think fair trade in steel is. So this is a foreshadowing. This is a precursor. This is a heads up. You have been warned. Climate is now going to be incorporated into trade policy, I think, writ large. Next slide. So I'll finish with this, just talk about sustainability. You know, we oftentimes talk about the three elements of sustainability. It's got to be environment. A food system must be environmentally, socially, and economically stable. Next slide. And one way to look at that is to say, well, we want to have clean production, you know, with not a lot of pollution and residues and emissions. We want to make sure farmers stay profitable, and we want to make sure food is available in both price and quantity. Next slide. And so I think the way to think about this, that these three elements shouldn't be thought of as trade-offs. You know, too often we think about, well, if we want to have cleaner production, it's going to hurt farm income because farmers will have to adopt more expensive production techniques, or we'll have to tax them. Or if we want to have more food available, we're going to have to swallow the fact that we're going to have to be less clean in our production, that we're going to have to cut down rainforests and use more chemicals. Or that if we want food to be available, that means that we're going to have lower prices, and that's got to come out of the farmer. So I don't like that framing. I think I don't think it's going to solve our problems. Instead, what we need to think about is how do we try and find an avenue that addresses all of these? How can we produce more off a smaller environmental footprint? How can we ensure there's available food for consumers while farmers are still getting a good price, right? And the way to do that is to find new and better ways to farm. It's a technology question, the ways of doing things. And the real challenge for us is what is the enabling environment that will attract investments so that companies will develop new products and encourage producers, farmers, to adopt those new products. And to do that, you've got to have open markets, because only if it's profitable will the innovation be invested in and will farmers apply them. So I think core to the sustainability argument is about how do we keep our markets open? How do we make sure that even if we're addressing common challenges on reducing emissions and cutting pollution, that we don't penalize countries who are using new technologies to achieve it. So that I think is going to be front and center of our conversations moving forward. Next slide. And so as we talk about new ways of talking about trade going forward, you know, we've seen already the climate element of steel. You know, it's something we have to think about in agriculture, is how do we factor in encouraging better climate policy, penalizing countries who have bad climate policy? How do we talk about forming subsidy policies that do encourage both higher productivity and lower emissions, less production, less pollution? How do we discourage countries that are using things that are environmentally negative, that they're subsidizing things like inputs, you know, fossil fuels or seeds, or over cultivation? How do we talk about getting market access opportunities when the WTO is so stuck about getting everybody to agree to cutting their tariffs, opening their markets? How do we adopt, either in the WTO, plurilateral approaches, or find ways to join in regional agreements to get more to address barriers that our producers face? And so I think these are both, I believe these are WTO questions. Each of these can and should be addressed in WTO, but it also should drive our regional strategy. So I think I stop with that. Next, one more slide. Yeah, so here's USDA's priorities, right? Climate smart agriculture and forestry, more and better markets, nutrition security, and equal opportunity, all while trying to make USDA a better place. This is throughout the department. You know, I find us comfortably, we are comfortably or uncomfortably in 1 and 2, clearly, right? Adopting climate smart agriculture is going to have trade implications, and more and better markets includes export markets. The Secretary is clear about that. And the other elements are important for us too. So I'm going to stop there. Thanks for your time. Appreciate your forbearance as I shared some of my thoughts.
Thank you, Jason. We have a couple of questions. One is, which is more important regarding trade agreements? Free trade / tariff relief or influence? We see the EU aggressively negotiating and announcing negotiations while we are largely on the sidelines and now without TPA.
Yeah, I'll answer it like this. I think there's sort of a black and white law that's important. Like, what's in the agreement? What is the tariff you face? What is the rule about production technology and the ability to reduce import access? So that's important. The lawyer in me says that's important. But there's also this general norm about what is considered acceptable, what is considered appropriate. And I think that can be as important as the black letter law. So I think it is concerning that the EU, by being very active in trade conversations, they are telling other countries, this is, as you are developing domestic policy, this is how you need to think about farm production. As you're developing domestic policy, this is how you need to think about health and safety. Even if it's not explicitly written in their trade agreements yet, they're definitely sending the message, like, if you want to do business with us, you better adopt our values. So I think that's all the more reason for us to get engaged. Now, we care about the bottom line, what the tariff is driven to, what the subsidy policy is, but just the fact to have other countries saying, hey, the US has an opinion about this, we need to take that into account, I think is very important.
Just one final question, Jason. Likewise, using the same type of model, is our steel quality that much better that our prices are twice as high? Or are countries lowballing us, or a combination?
Yeah, we have high prices in the US because we are very aggressive users of anti-dumping and countervailing duties. And so very few countries are able to sell us steel without having a tariff applied to it. So that helps prop up higher domestic US prices. It keeps some profitability in the US industry, but it results in higher steel costs. I don't think it's a quality element at all.
Well, thank you very much, Jason, for your thoughts. We appreciate that you were able to attend the conference and speak to our attendees.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'll listen in with interest.
And now we will move to the first sponsor raffle. I'd like to introduce Brad Rose from Rose Research, who will conduct this raffle. Hello, Brad.
Hey, Chuck. Good to see you this way. It's nice to see everybody. And as Paul said, it'll be nice when we can do this in person, hopefully in July of next year. We've been selected to do the first of a number of raffles for the next 2 days to hopefully keep everybody even more engaged than you already are. Jason, that was a great presentation. Thank you. Lorena, I also wanted to thank you as well for giving me the opportunity of living out my childhood dream of being a game show host, because as you guys will see soon, we're going to have a spinning wheel that will spin around, and it will select one lucky winner for our first raffle. We will be raffling off from Rose Research. We'll be raffling off 2 bottles of wine. I have an example here of our white. You can choose white or red. I don't know how specific we get in terms of varietals, but we'll do our best to make as many accommodations as we can for our winners. There will also be a lot of other great giveaways. I know that we're raffling off, I believe, some Apple Watches as well. We spoke to ourselves here, Kelly, David, and myself at Rose Research, about what we thought would be appropriate for this group. And we always remembered seeing such long lines at the bars during the welcome reception. We thought giving away some alcohol would be a good idea. Now, like I said, this bottle is just an example. The fact that it's in my hand probably means that it will not make it to the light of day tomorrow. I'm going to bring this home and enjoy it with myself and my wife, and we'll see how much of this she gets to drink as well. With that, I think, why don't we see if we can get this thing rolling and get this wheel spinning and see if we can pick a winner. So in my game show host persona, I'm going to say, spin that wheel. And let's see what happens here. The excitement is the suspense is killing me, as I'm sure it is all of you. Let's see who our first winner is. Our first winner is Katie Wyatt. So Katie, I think that we're going to ask that you just somehow send a message to the group, to Lorena, or to somebody in the group that you are here and that you can receive this. If you can say in the chat that you are here and in attendance, you will be our first winner. We're going to give you about, I think, 10 seconds. And otherwise, I'm going to have to say, spin that wheel again. There we go. So it looks like, I believe Katie is here. So thank you all very much. And I look forward to, we'll be seeing you tomorrow with more wine. Like I said, this bottle will not make it, but we'll have another one. Maybe we'll bring a bottle of our red tomorrow. So thank you all very much. We look forward to seeing the rest of everybody's presentations and participating. And I can't wait to hear from everybody else. Take care, and we'll see you guys tomorrow.
Thank you, Brad, and thank you, Rose Research. So our next speaker is Sarah Garcia Figueroa, who is a consultant at Prospera.ag and will share her thoughts on the Green Deal and its implications for U.S. agricultural exports. Sarah, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chuck, and thank you very much for the invitation to present here. Let me share my screen, and I hope that it will work. Can someone confirm that you're seeing it?
Yes.
Okay, so hello everyone. My name is Sarah and I'm a consultant at Prospera and Partners. And today my presentation is gonna focus on the EU Green Deal and some implications for US agricultural exports. So I'm gonna start with a really brief presentation about Prospera and Partners and the types of reports and services that we can provide. And then I'm going to jump straight into an overview of the EU Green Deal that some of you might be familiar with, and then start to focus on the three types of policies that we identified within that the EU Green Deal that could directly affect agricultural exports from the EU, from the US into the EU. Policies that could affect the competitiveness of US versus EU growers, and then some policies that could affect the demand within the EU market for agricultural products, for example, from the US, and some conclusions and recommendations. So just so you know, Prospera and Partners, we call ourselves the Agri-Food Transformation Company. We've been working to help organizations make difficult changes at the interface of the technological and human dimensions of food systems. So we're based in Europe. We have consultants from different parts of the EU. I'm based in Spain. And for more than 20 years, Prospera has been working with organizations in agri-food to understand and proactively shape their operating environments, to engage meaningfully with relevant stakeholders, and to manage the dynamics of regulatory and public policy change. And we're very grateful that the Almond Board of California recommended us for this meeting and that we were invited by the USAEDC. So some of the things that we can do to help your organizations are to understand the regulatory risk and the public policy issues in the US that could affect the operating environments and the trade conditions for US exports. We are an agri-food specialist, so we can provide a sector-specific perspective. We can deliver timely intelligence about the different developments that are currently happening at the EU regulatory and policy environments. We can identify some of the items that are actionable and actually prioritize those actions based on some criteria such as public impact, the impact that it could have for your business, the level of influence and time sensitivity. We can find effective ways to communicate with key stakeholders and to build relationships. And then after this, let's jump into the EU Green Deal. So as some of you may know, the EU Commission was put together, the current EU Commission was put together after the last EU Parliament elections that happened in May of 2019. And in December of that year, once the EU Commission was constituted, they published the EU Green Deal, which is supposed to be the roadmap for the next 5 years. So it's going to be the EU growth strategy for the coming years, with the overall goal of transforming the EU economy into for a sustainable future. So one of the goals is to make the EU economy carbon neutral by 2050. And that is supposed to be achieved by a series of goals that are specified here. Increasing the EU climate ambition for 2030 and 2050, supplying clean, affordable, and secure energy, mobilizing industry for a clean and circular economy, building and renovating in an energy and resource efficient way, zero pollution for a toxic-free environment, and then some of the goals that are more relevant for agricultural exports or forest or fishery exports, which are preserving and restoring ecosystems and biodiversity. And that is related to the biodiversity strategy that I will be explaining in this presentation. And then the following farm to fork strategy, trying to aim for a fair, healthy, and environmentally friendly food system. And then there's also accelerating the shift to a sustainable and smart mobility. And overall, this is supposed to be achieved by leaving no one behind and positioning the EU as a global leader. So this was the roadmap that was set in 2019. And some of those strategies, the biodiversity strategy, the farm to fork, and to some extent, the climate strategy and the circular economy one are going to, they are constituted by a series of initiatives that when they become policies and regulations might end up affecting agricultural exports into the EU. And as you can see in the following slide, the timeline so far, we're still at an early stage. As I mentioned, the elections happened in May of 2019. So the European Commission was appointed in September of 2019. The Green Deal was published in December of that year. But as I'm sure you're aware, in March of 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic hit the EU, and there were severe movement restrictions in many EU countries. So a lot of the efforts that were going to go into implementing the EU Green Deal ended up being used in fighting the pandemic. So a lot of these initiatives got delayed. Nevertheless, the farm to fork strategy and the biodiversity strategy were published in May of last year. And in December of last year, it was when the EU budget for the next period from 2021 to 2027 was approved, together with the Next Generation EU funds. And that set the entire budget that is going to be used to implement some of these initiatives. Then this year, in June of 2021, we reached a milestone because there was political agreement of the Common Agricultural Policy. The CAP was originally, the proposals from the Commission came from back, if you go to the left, back to June of 2018. That was when the CAP proposal was made. But because of some of these issues like the COVID-19 pandemic, agreement between the Council and the Parliament was not reached until June of this year. So the CAP is going to be delayed and it will be implemented in 2023. And this is very important because as I will explain during the presentation, some of the objectives that were set by the Green Deal will be achieved partly, at least the ones that relate to agriculture, through the CAP, the same way that the ones that relate to fisheries will be achieved through the common fisheries policies. And then there are things that are happening at the moment. For example, in October of this year, in last month, actually, the EU Parliament published their own report on the farm to fork strategy that I will cover in a following slide. Just this week on Monday, the Council met to go over some of these strategies. So as you can see, there's a lot going on at the moment, and I'll try to cover some key points during this presentation. So starting with the first category, the policies that we identified that could directly affect agricultural imports into the EU. I wanted to start by focusing on the biodiversity strategy because some of those policies are going to be related to this strategy. And I'm not sure if some of you might have read the communication from the Commission, but basically the biodiversity strategy is aimed at preserving the natural resources in the EU. So it sets some aspirational targets at the EU level that are non-binding. They will become binding at the member state level, so at the country level. But overall, the EU is intending to turn at least 30% of the land and 30% of the seas into protected areas. Another target is to reverse the decline of pollinators. This is very relevant for agriculture to reduce by 50% the overall use of and risk of chemical pesticides, and by the use of the most hazardous pesticides by 50%. So that's going to impact the use of plant protection products in the EU. Reduce nutrient losses by at least 50%, and specifically reduce the use of fertilizers by at least 20%. Turning at least 25% of the EU agricultural land under organic farming, and also promoting organic aquaculture. And turning 10% of the agricultural area in the EU into high diversity landscape features, such as, for example, flower strips around fields, which is going to reduce the land that is devoted to agriculture. So how is the EU going to achieve these aspirational targets that are part of the Green Deal? I'm going to focus on a few initiatives. For example, in order to reverse the decline of pollinators and to reduce the use of pesticides, one of the initiatives is the revision of the Sustainable Use of Pesticides Directive. This was a directive from 2009 that was assessed by the European Court of Auditors very recently. And one of the things they mentioned was that the EU had not moved enough towards integrated pest management. So there's a proposal to review that directive, and that is going to affect two key regulations that might affect imports of agricultural products into the EU, which are the Regulation 1107/2009 concerning the placing of plant protection products on the market. That is the regulation that approves the active substances that are used in the EU. And there are changes in many active substances that are expected as the SUD directive gets revised. And also the EU is trying to promote market access for bio-based active substances. Another thing that is going to be probably impacted is the regulation on maximum residue levels of pesticides, or MRLs, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with. The MRLs are constantly changed, but they will also change under these strategies. And the Commission has already mentioned that they will take into account environmental aspects when they assess the requests for import tolerances for substances that are no longer approved in the EU. So that is going to impact imports directly. And also related, as part of the revision of the EU pollinators initiatives, there are some studies going on at the moment at the European Food Safety Agency, or EFSA, to develop guidance on the risk assessment of plant protection products on bees. So some of the products that are used that could affect bees might also be affected. In terms of another target, turning at least 25% of the EU agricultural land under organic farming, there was a regulation that was passed in 2018, which is going to come into force next January of 2022. And that regulation broadened the scope of organic products that are regulated in the EU. And one thing that might affect imports, it's that it's going to change the current recognition of equivalence scheme to be replaced by a certification scheme. That will start next January, but it will give a transition period until the end of 2026. And in terms of how to promote this increase in agricultural land, there's also an action plan for the development of EU organic production that is supposed to stimulate demand, to stimulate conversion, and to promote the contribution of organic farming to environmental sustainability. So there's a whole push at the EU across the EU for organic production, and that might affect, for example, the imports of organic products into the from the US into the EU. Moving into some of the policies that we identified that could affect competitiveness of US versus EU growers or US versus EU products. We think some of those policies are more related to the farm to fork strategy under the EU Green Deal, although you'll see that some of the goals are shared between the farm to fork and the biodiversity strategy. But the farm to fork strategy is mainly aimed at changing the food system in the EU to reduce the environmental and climate footprint of the food system, to lead a global transition towards competitive sustainability from farm to fork, to, of course, develop new opportunities and to create a robust and resilient food system. And this has only been strengthened after the COVID-19 pandemic and seeing how some of these high-level pandemics can affect food systems. So to achieve those overall goals, there are 2 horizontal flagship actions that are going to apply to all levels of the food supply chain. One of them is to develop a contingency plan for ensuring food supply. I think that was published, the first version, this week. It's supposed to come before the end of the year. And there's also going to be a proposal for a legislative framework for sustainable food systems. And the Commission said that they would do that by 2023. So those are the flagship actions, but then there are 25 initial actions that are supposed to tackle specific issues along the different stages of the food value chain. So 10 actions have been proposed to promote sustainable food production, and that's going to affect livestock production and plant production. And now I will mention some of those. 7 different actions to stimulate sustainable food processing, wholesale, retail, hospitality, and food services practices. Then moving into the consumers, actions for promoting sustainable food consumption, facilitating the shift towards healthy and sustainable diets. And then actions for reducing food loss and waste, which are also shared with the circular economy strategy under the Green Deal. So, and again, these actions are also supposed to fulfill aspirational targets at the EU level. Some of those are shared with the biodiversity strategy, so reducing the use of pesticides, reducing the use of fertilizers, also reducing the sales of antimicrobials for farmed animals and aquaculture, which is going to impact livestock and aquaculture production, and then turning 10% of agricultural area under high diversity landscape features. And I'm not sure if you have seen those, but there have been several reports, at least 4 of them published using different simulation models and different scenarios that try to see how some of these targets could affect agricultural production in the EU and abroad. And although they use different models, I think across the 4 of them, they were showing that there might be a reduction in agricultural production and an increase in prices, and that might affect international flows in agricultural products. So despite those not so favorable predictions, when the EU Parliament examined the farm to fork strategy, which came from the Commission, they published a report on October 20th this year, so the past month, and they stressed the need for the farm to fork strategy to ensure that farmers can earn a fair share of the profit. Maybe adapting competition rules, also supporting the implementation of these targets through the Common Agricultural Policy, that the EU should make recommendations for healthy diets. And one of the initiatives under this is the front of pack nutrition labeling scheme that I'll be talking about. That the EU should set maximum intake levels for meat and highly processed foods. So there's going to be a movement towards more plant-based diets and reducing salt, sugar, or fat content in food. establishing binding reduction targets for pesticide use. So not only the aspirational targets at the EU level, but binding them at the national level and through the CAP strategic plans. The natural carbon sinks must be restored. So that's going to be related to the soil strategy that was published today. And then ending the use of cages in EU animal farming and increasing organic land. So as you know, the EU is a constant play between the Commission, the Council, and the Parliament, but the Parliament is supposed to represent more closely the views of the EU citizens, because those are the Parliament members are elected directly by vote. So although the Commission can ignore this report, it might strengthen some of the measures to achieve these objectives. So it's still to see how this is all going to unfold. But related to the actions under the Farm to Fork strategy to ensure sustainable food production, some of the initiatives that might affect the competitiveness of US products in the EU market are, for example, the revision of the animal welfare legislation, which is supposed to aim for a higher level of animal welfare and to, in part, to respond to consumer demands like the End the Cage Age initiative. So there's currently an open consultation on the roadmap for that revision that you could submit comments to. And the EU is also going to consider future options for animal welfare labeling. So currently there's only mandatory labeling for organic and eggs in shell, and it's supposed to broaden the scope of animal welfare labeling to other products. In terms of also to achieve sustainable plant production and specifically to reduce nutrient losses, there are several initiatives that are going to affect the use of fertilizers in the EU, which might also affect competitiveness. Those are, for example, the Integrated Nutrient Management Action Plan that is going to be tackled for later this year. We still haven't seen the roadmap. There's an app that has been developed, the Farm Sustainability Tool for Nutrients, that is going to integrate sources of data to help EU farmers improve their use of fertilizers. So for example, anything that has been done at the US level to develop these types of tools might be relevant to be shown when the products are placed on the market. And then today, actually, the new EU soil strategy was published with the overall aim to achieve land degradation neutrality by 2030, and that is going to trigger the promotion of soil fertility practices, reducing erosion, and those types of measures. So some of those measures are going to be implemented through the Common Agricultural Policy, or the CAP. I know this is a complex slide, but what I wanted to show was that in 2018, when the legislative proposals for the CAP were put together by the Commission, 9 objectives were set, 3 related to economic sustainability, 3 related to environmental sustainability, and 3 related to social sustainability. And the whole idea was to set those objectives at the EU level and then let member states select which measures they're going to implement to achieve those objectives. So the EU would set the basic rules, but it would be the member states who would develop what are called the CAP strategic plans, in which they say how they are going to achieve those objectives, adapting them to their country circumstances. And the EU Commission is supposed to supervise those CAP strategic plans and then monitor implementation through a series of indicators. So one of the implications of this is that the CAP that is going to start in 2023 and will go until 2027 is going to be a bit more decentralized. And although the CAP was designed before the EU Green Deal, there was a communication published together with the Farm to Fork strategy and the biodiversity strategy that is supposed to link the Common Agricultural Policy with the targets that I just mentioned, the reduction of pesticide use, the reduction of fertilizer or antibiotic use, So member states in the EU, in the CAP strategic plans, will have to set national targets for those reductions and then explain through which measures their farmers will achieve those targets. So the new CAP will provide basic funding, and then they will reward those growers that have adopted precision agriculture, organic farming, agroecology, and those types of measures. In terms of other strategies, so let me go back here. So the CAP strategic plans are currently under development by the member states. They are supposed to be sending those to the Commission by the end of this year. So until then, it will be hard to get a clear idea of how the Green Deal is going to be implemented, at least at the farm level. But after that, those strategic plans might give some guidance. Then leaving the farm to fork strategy and getting into the climate strategy. Here in this slide, you can see the climate targets that were set at the EU, well, the different strategies that were set to achieve the climate targets by 2030. And I just wanted to highlight a couple of them that might be more relevant to this audience. The EU forest strategy that was discussed in the Council this Monday, it got some opposition from EU member states because they think that the EU might be getting into the national level decisions a bit too much. But the whole idea of the EU forest strategy is to promote the role of forests for absorbing CO2 and to promote the planting of trees. And there were some concerns in the EU forest strategy about maybe more imports that would not meet tightened environmental rules, so that might affect competitiveness in the EU market. And then the carbon border adjustment mechanism is not supposed to affect agricultural products. It will affect fertilizers. But I just wanted to highlight there was a recent report from the European Parliament, the Committee on Agriculture and Rural Development, that said that suggested that the scope of the CBAM should be extended to agricultural products. So that might be coming. The two initiatives that are directly more relevant for the competitiveness of agricultural products in the EU market will be the carbon farming initiative that is supposed to create direct incentives for the adoption of climate-friendly practices, because as you can see on the diagram, and I'm sure you know, the soil can be a very important carbon sink. And the action plan is expected to be based on a previous study and to be published by the end of this year. And then further on, the EU is aiming to develop a regulatory framework for certifying carbon removals. So anything that can be done to align work that is going on at the moment in the US with these types of initiatives will be advantageous to confer competitiveness. And finally, in terms of policies that might affect the demand for agricultural products in the EU market, I wanted to highlight a couple. Related to the farm to fork strategy and the actions for stimulating sustainable food processing, there's an ongoing revision of EU marketing standards that is supposed to incorporate sustainability issues. So that might affect how products are perceived by EU consumers. And marketing standards are also under revision for fishery and aquaculture products. So there will be opportunities for engagement with key stakeholders once the Commission adopts these two revisions. In terms of the actions to promote sustainable food consumption, I mentioned before, there's a project to develop a harmonized front-of-pack nutrition labeling scheme across the EU. EFSA is currently evaluating different options, and this is supposed to be published towards the end of the year. And also voluntary green claims are going to be harmonized. So just to wrap up and to provide some conclusions, as you saw throughout the presentation and hopefully in the timeline at the beginning, The implementation of the EU Green Deal is still at an early stage. There are aspirational targets have been set, the strategies have been published, but most of the initiatives are still being developed and the regulations have not been finalized. So there are opportunities for action and for engagement. Some of those targets, especially the ones that are related to farm and to the farm level practices and plant production, livestock production, how they are operationalized will depend on the common agricultural policy and especially the strategic plans that EU member states develop. So to get a better idea of how this is all going to be achieved, might require some monitoring at the national level and engaging with a few member states of the EU that are more interest to your organizations. But for sure, and everyone is worried about this from the plant protection and the fertilizer sectors in the EU, there's going to be changes in the use of these products, and that might have, as EU farmers are asked to reduce the use of pesticides and fertilizers, that might have knock-on effects on imported products. One thing that we have found over the years is that providing evidence-based argumentation tends to be more effective with the EU stakeholders. So anything that can show how US agricultural production aligns with these objectives, any benchmarking initiatives, will help you prove that any sustainability claims are verifiable. And this is going to be very important moving forward. And then finally, there was an ambitious agenda that was set to promote sustainability across the food system, to reduce food waste, to promote healthier diets. And this involves changing marketing standards, the harmonized front of pack nutrition labeling, the voluntary green claims. But these are still at an early stage, so input will be welcome throughout 2021 and 2022. And we'll be happy to work with any of your organizations if you want more help in better tackling these issues. So with this, I wanted to thank you all for your time, and I'll be happy to take any questions if there's still time. Thanks.
Thank you, Sarah. That was a very comprehensive presentation. We got a question here. How does the EU Green Deal affect agricultural imports to the EU?
It's what I was mentioning. We're not sure it's going to affect imports directly, but because it's a policy for EU production. But throughout several places in the Green Deal, the EU has stressed their intentions to hold imported products to the same standards. So we're not sure yet how this might affect agricultural imports, but we think it will affect like sustainability claims, MRLs, some of the issues that I'm sure you deal with when you try to import products into the EU. I hope that answered the question.
Thank you. Earlier, you had mentioned that one of the key factors is to help preserve farm incomes. And you mentioned competition rules. What is that actually? Is that for the farmers or for the importers or the distributors? How are they going to manage competition to preserve farm income?
I'm not sure. That was on the EU Parliament report. I'm not sure what they were thinking, but I think one of the things that we have seen is that VAT, for example, there was a proposal to change it and to change the taxes depending on how the food had been produced in order to favor more sustainably produced food products to give them a more favorable access to the market.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions for Sarah? One more question came in. The front of pack labeling is quite interesting. Can you provide examples of what factors will be addressed on the front of the pack? Do you have examples of the draft front of package that we can share with our stakeholders?
Sure. So it might be, I'm not sure if you're familiar with other, so there are already front of pack nutrition labels that are in use in some EU countries. One of them is Nutri-Score, which is used in France or in Spain, for example. And it's every food product is given a score. Well, it's like from A to E and a color. So things that are rated in green are supposed to be better for your health than things that are rated in red. And that gives consumers a clear understanding of the nutritional value of the product. That is one of the schemes that is being assessed. Another one is the one Nutri-Inform, which is used in Italy. And that provides like a battery representation of the content of sugar, salt, and fat, I think, in the product. And that helps consumers also like get a clear and quick idea of the nutritional value of the product. But the EU hasn't made a decision yet on the one that they will implement.
Thank you very much. There are several more questions here. We'll try to get to these two, and that'll probably be it. Will the EU Green Deal provide incentives to local farmers on other continents beyond the EU member states due to the predicted production loss and increased prices?
I'm not sure. I don't know how to answer that question. Not probably, at least not through the Common Agricultural Policy, because that is supposed to apply only to EU-based growers, but they might be given incentives, for example, with sustainable claims or voluntary green claims that might justify their access to certain markets that other products wouldn't access.
Thank you. Just one final question. How does sustainability standards developed and adapted by the EU impact exporting countries?
It's still unclear at the moment. That part of the EU Green Deal about promoting sustainable food systems in other countries, it's not obvious yet how that is going to be achieved. But my guess is that, for example, by implementing these labeling requirements or these marketing requirements, products that are produced elsewhere that are sold in the EU market will have to conform to some of those standards, probably through certification schemes.
Well, thank you very much for a fine presentation. And we will move on to the next presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Our next session is a panel entitled Water, Water Everywhere, but No Ships, Containers, or Deliveries in Sight. Peter Friedman, the Executive Director of the Agricultural Transportation Coalition, will moderate this session and handle questions at the end. Peter, I will turn it over to you now.
Great. Thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity here to work with USAEDC. Lorena Alfaro has been terrific as a great organizer for this event. And we are expecting now approximately 160 members of the Agricultural Transportation Coalition to join everybody else who's on, and many members of the USAEDC are members of the Agriculture Transportation Coalition. That isn't just our quote that said the principal voice of agriculture exporters in U.S. transportation policy, but that's what the Journal of Commerce has said, and we're sticking with it. And so we're apologize that we only have photos of 12 of the myriad of agriculture and forest products that commodities that the Agriculture Transportation Coalition represents and advocates for at the Federal Maritime Commission, on Capitol Hill, and particularly now with new legislation. So I'd like to welcome folks to this joint Agriculture Transportation Coalition, U.S. Department of Agriculture, Ag Shipper Workshop, this time in conjunction with USAIDC. This one will be a little different for all of those who have participated in our 16 workshops conducted last year and again this year. And that is that this is a webinar. So if you want to communicate, do it through the chat. That will be great. And I'll be watching for that even as the other speakers today perform. Usually at our webinar, our workshops, it's open for everybody to unmute and tell us what they're thinking or ask the questions. So we're glad to have you all on board today, even in this format that's a little different. I would say that we have so much going on, and so what we're going to do today in the 60 minutes, and we will end it exactly at 1:15 Pacific, 4:15 Eastern, this session. But we are going to have Congressman Garamendi from Northern California. I'll introduce him then, but one of the sponsors, original sponsors of the Ocean Shipping Reform Act legislation, which is desperately needed. He is going to make an appearance here, and we're appreciating that. Stein Rubens is with the Drury. Drury is a globally known maritime economists and consultants and advisors. And what he's going to do, broadcasting to join us from Amsterdam, Holland, he is going to give us the answer to the question that we all need an answer to. And that is, when is this whole conflagration, this whole congestion, this whole cluster, this whole impediment to US agriculture exports, when is that going to taper off? And then we're going to have Paul Snell. We could take my slide off if we can for a moment and put it on a little bit later, if you would. And then we're going to have Paul Snell, a freight forwarder, British American Forwarding in customs brokers in California. He's going to talk very hands-on. What does it take to export agriculture in this current environment that's unprecedented, so challenging that we're fighting battles every single day, frankly. And he's going to talk about these battles. He's going to talk about the workarounds. I think it'll be very useful. So for that, I will begin by providing sort of an overview of where things stand as of right this minute. And our AgTC members know, you all know, that you're getting constant updates, hopefully not too many, too frequently, but at least we keep them brief. By the way, AgTC members, we have a few of these very valuable AgTC mugs from our virtual annual meeting. And if you want a mug, send an email to us to info@agtrans.org, and we'll make sure you have your snail mail address where we can mail this where you are, and we'll send you one of the valuable but few remaining mugs. So let me just start out by saying, and I'll be interrupted here by Congressman Garamendi, who will join in a few minutes. But I'm going to begin now telling you, we have a situation where U.S. Department of Agriculture, the U.S. Department of Transportation, at the secretary's level, Secretary Buttigieg has been very active on a personal level, and the White House, with Vice President Harris involved, and others, have been all seeking solutions. What are the solutions? And what is fortunate is they're not only looking for solutions to what the American public is generally concerned about, like where are we going to get our toys to give to our kids for Christmas? Okay, you've been to the stores, the retailer stores, the shelves are largely empty. And when you order online, the things that used to be delivered tomorrow or the next day are maybe back ordered for a week or two. So all these challenges have the impact on imports of this current supply chain crisis very much in the public's eye, and also very much in the eye of the elected officials on Capitol Hill, and particularly the White House. The White House conducted a roundtable. It was in the White House. Participating were the presidents of Walmart. We're not talking the logistics people only. We're talking about president, CEO of Walmart and so forth. They have all been participating, but they also included the Agriculture Transportation Coalition because exports are critical. Now, I am very pleased to welcome Congressman John Garamendi. Congressman Garamendi of Northern California joined in a bipartisan manner with Congressman Dusty Johnson of South Dakota to introduce an excellent Ocean Shipping Reform Act of 2021. We're very grateful for your leadership, Congressman, and we welcome you to tell us a little bit about your motivations for it and what your plans are. Thank you very much.
Well, I think my motivations are similar to most everybody that's on this Zoom meeting. We were contacted several months ago by the agricultural exporters in my district. I have a very, very large agricultural district. It's 200 miles of the Sacramento River Valley. We grow most everything, and certainly if you want to drink wine, well, you can go to Napa, but the really good wine is in the Sacramento Valley. And rice and almonds and you name it. They contacted me and said, we got a problem. I said, well, that wouldn't be the first time I've heard that from agriculture, but what's today's problem? I said, we can't ship. We cannot get a container. And if we do get a container, we can't get it on a ship. And so we began looking into it. And with Dusty Johnston out of South Dakota, we learned from you and others, the nature of the problem is one that we have a very unfair import-export system. And that the players in the system have become, some of the players have become extraordinarily powerful, particularly the 5 major ocean shipping lines. And they simply have come to the conclusion now that the, well, what was it, for 20 months, we were all sitting at the intersection with the stoplight saying red. And suddenly it turns green and everybody hits the accelerator, and now we're jammed up at the next stoplight, which was this congestion problem. But the shippers really have created a very unfair situation in which they have determined and discovered that they're able to get perhaps 10 times more money from a Chinese exporter who wants that container to fill it with Christmas supplies than they would get from a California rice grower that's going to ship into the Western market. So what we did with this legislation is to empower the federal FMC, the Federal Maritime Commission, to establish a fair and equitable playing field on which American exporters, whether they are agriculture or Caterpillar or whatever, will be able to export their products at a reasonable rate in a reasonable time. That simply doesn't exist today. The problem has been made worse by the congestion at the ports. We just finished a 5-hour hearing in the Transportation Infrastructure Committee on that issue. After listening to a good portion of that, I came to the conclusion that this piece of legislation may be the one thing that can immediately bring about some better, more fair playing field for agricultural exporters. What it does, it sets the commission with the power to deal with charges, demurrage charges and others, and also to fine when necessary, and to investigate why things are not, why the import-export is imbalanced or unfair. It provides the power for the federal government to set up a fair, equitable field upon which importers and exporters can export or import and do it in a fair and equitable way. So we're very excited about it. We hope to have a hearing on this before the Christmas holidays and quite possibly move it out of the House of Representatives. We have over 200 organizations around the United States, and we're approaching well over 100 members of Congress that are now signed on to the bill as co-sponsors. Furthermore, we are in negotiations with 3 different senators who are interested in a similar piece of legislation on the Senate side or some piece of this legislation. So we expect very shortly to have not only a bipartisan, but also a bicameral piece of legislation. And I thank you for your support and interest in the bill. Thank you so very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Congressman Garamendi. And I would just say that Ian Hart of your staff has done a magnificent job in working with the trade, really listening and learning a very complex piece of legislation. And I think that is one of the reasons your bill is a good bill. We have the Senate moving forward with a bill. And as we have informed the Senate, it is nowhere near sufficient. It is nowhere near as effective as the Garamendi-Johnson bill. And we think the Senate ought to simply take your good work and move forward with it. But you have to deal with senators, and that's a different program.
Well, I'll always recall my first day here more than 11 years ago, and I was sitting down next to John Dingell, who I'd known when I was back here in Washington in the 1990s as Deputy Secretary at the Department of Interior. And he says, "Hey, John, come sit down." I said, "Certainly, Mr. Dingell." And he said, "Well, first thing, a couple of things you need to know, son." I said, "What's that, Mr. Dingell?" And he said, "My name's John." "Okay, Mr. Dingell." He said, "Hey, come on, you're a faster learner than that." I said, "Okay, what's the second thing?" He said, "You know where you are?" I said, "Yeah, I'm on the floor of the House." He said, "Yep." "Do you know who's on the other side of the aisle over there?" And I said, "Republicans." He said, "Yep, that's the opposition." "And you know what's on the other side of this building?" I said, "The Senate." He said, "No, that's the enemy." And recent days tend to show that up. I think the senators are going to come on board when they get a full understanding of the problem that American exporters are facing. And I would expect we will have a very similar bill. Of course, each of us has a pride of authorship, and we, of course, will deal with that along the way. But your advocacy is going to be very helpful. The closer the bills are together, the more likely it is we'll get something done quickly. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And we have, in addition to so many of your constituents as members of the AgTC, we do have a lot of folks in Minnesota, in North Dakota, South Dakota, and none of our ag exporters are shy, as you know. And with the challenges facing them right now, particularly not shy right now. So thank you.
As you go about that, particularly from that area, Senator Klobuchar has an extremely important committee in this matter, not on this particular bill, but there are 5 international ocean shipping carriers that control almost 90% of the market. And so while it may not be a monopoly, it's certainly an oligopoly. And I know that Senator Klobuchar is interested in this, and she is the chairperson of that committee. And clearly part of the problem is that these big carriers are excluded from the antitrust laws of America. And therein lies part of this problem. Our bill doesn't go to that. But as we've worked this piece of legislation, we've become more and more convinced that that is a problem, and that the antitrust laws of the United States should be applied to ocean carriers. That's not currently the law, but it's worth consideration.
Thank you very much. When I heard Senator Klobuchar was going to introduce a bill, I was very excited because I was thinking as well about the Judiciary Committee. And if you don't mind for just a second, just for the other folks that are on, Under the current law that exists today, the ocean carriers are, as Congressman Garamendi says, exempt from our rules of competition, antitrust laws, but specifically the law says these carriers are allowed to meet together and control, regulate, or prevent competition in international ocean transportation. That's pretty blunt. They may limit or regulate the volume or character of cargo they carry. They can discuss, fix, or regulate transportation rates among themselves. And worst, they can pool or apportion cargo, revenues, earnings, or losses among themselves. So, you know, that really puts some specificity, and the reason that Congressman Garamendi, you're 100% right. We really appreciate you saying that, and we're going to try to get a lot of soybean farmers in Minnesota inform Senator Klobuchar that maybe she needs to focus more on judiciary jurisdiction than on Commerce Committee jurisdiction.
Go for it. It's a big problem. It really is. Way back when I was at the University of California, Berkeley, I took a minor in economics, and a big piece of that from a very extraordinary professor dealt with competition. You know, we read Mills, we read all of the, and the last chapters of the great writing on market economy was that it can run out of control and needs to have boundaries and regulatory boundaries around it. And then that's exactly what we're seeing here today. Yes, please do that. All the soybean farmers and anybody else that is interested in a free market system, that market system cannot survive with laws that basically prevent competition.
Well, one soybean farmer has already responded, and a constituent of the chairman of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee has already responded on the, so this is good. You're going to have to give me some protection because when I started this, I was as tall as you are. For folks who don't know, Congressman Garamendi is very tall, and now I'm significantly shorter. So we'll keep working on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good to be with you. Thank you for the support of the bill. We look forward to working together. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Okay, folks, for the webinar, we're going to continue moving along here. There's a lot more to discuss about the challenges that are out there right now and some of the things that we're pursuing. But I think you got a really good sense of a member of Congress who's really tuned in and wants to get some solutions in here and is not afraid of really rocking the boat. I am sure there are ocean carrier lawyers and lobbyists who are jumping out of windows right now after hearing him, but that means that there could be some solutions that will benefit agriculture exporters nationwide. So before I go further into what's going on here in DC and out at the ports and so forth, I'd like to turn it over to get the answer to the question that we all have. When is this situation, this cluster, this lack of ocean carrier capacity, this lack of service, these skyrocketing freight rates, the detention and demurrage and everything else, lack of schedule integrity, when is that going to end? Or at least begin to abate? And we're very pleased that we have Stein Rubens, again, as I said, broadcasting from his headquarters in Amsterdam with Drury to give us information that I thought was very, very useful, because he proves to us that all these great predictions that we've been making over the years, or last couple of years, of when this is going to end, which have all been proven wrong, he's got the data. Stein, welcome.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you for this kind introduction. I wanted to check whether if I flick to the next slide, does the screen follow?
Yep, it did.
Okay, good. Then I'm ready to kick this off. So hello, everybody. Welcome to this presentation, during which I will be sharing Drewry's outlook for the container shipping market with highlights taken from our latest Container Forecaster quarterly report, published at the end of September. So I will start the presentation with some reflections on the current supply chain disruption. Then we will go over to Drewry's demand outlook, first for global demand, and then we'll zoom in on the North American region. Then follows the confrontation of supply and demand with Drewry's 5-year supply demand forecast. And we'll close this presentation with our outlook for freight rates and carrier profits. Now, everything I will talk about today can be tracked back to COVID-19 and its devastating impact on every link of the supply chain. This slide gives an overview of the pandemic's impact on the container market, as well as listing some of the important indicators that Drewry thinks provide the best directional clues. I won't go into the various cause and effects on this slide. I'll assume most of you are now fully versed on these, but because our predictions for no supply chain recovery before 2023 relies on much more gut instinct than we would normally be comfortable with, it is probably for the best that I cover this ground at the top of the presentation. Now, the primary driver for our forecasts continues to be the supply chain disruption. And unfortunately, nearly 2 years into the pandemic, it still carries the greatest uncertainty. Our previous position only 3 months ago was that supply chain disruption would be cleared by the second quarter of 2022. But in the recent container forecast, we have extended the recovery timeline to the end of 2022. Here is why. We had expected more progress by now, but supply chain efficiency has actually deteriorated of late, attributable to a number of factors, one of which being China's zero COVID policy. That shut some big container terminals, although briefly, after only a handful of cases. Another factor is the several extreme weather events around the world that threw off operations. Now, each sector will have their own plans to manage the situation and an investment strategy to try and prevent repeat occurrences. But more often than not, they are working in silos. And the lack of joined-up thinking is one of the reasons we are now less optimistic about a solution being found over the next few months. Part of the problem when predicting the recovery timeline is that we have good visibility on the ocean side of things, including ports and terminals, but data quality and availability for inland operations is much less abundant. Instead, we are relying more on anecdotal sources, such as industry surveys on trucking shortages, and lots of conversations with insiders. The more we learn, the more we think the problem goes much deeper than originally feared, and that in some cases the pandemic has merely accelerated latent crises within these sectors. And while normally you might hope that a localized issue could be worked around, because this problem, COVID, affects every aspect of the supply chain, there are no simple fixes. It is going to require time and investment to add more logistics capacity, but also a huge amount of luck, i.e. avoiding another spike in cases, extreme weather events, or accidents such as the Suez grounding. So global demand outlook. While the container shipping network has clearly been under intense pressure for a good while now, a lot of goods are still getting through eventually. Drewry expects world port handling to increase by 8.2% this year compared to last, which is also 7.2% against the pre-pandemic 2019. For next year, our outlook is for a 5.2% increase. Although rising inflationary pressures, partly as a direct consequence of the supply chain inefficiencies that have supercharged transportation costs, stand out as a downside risk. A downside risk to volumes, meaning obviously an upside risk or an upside for a faster recovery. Here we zoom in on the North American sector. And in North America, we see port throughput fell by about 1.5% in 2020, which is slightly steeper than the global average of -1%. Volumes fell sharpest for the East and the West Coast ports, and that is also where the 2021 recovery is the steepest. Overall, Drury thinks North American ports will handle more than 10 million TEU more in 2021 than they did last year, which is an increase of almost 16%. However, there is now growing evidence that the boom has peaked and that consumer spending is moderating. Subsequently, the outlook for 2022 to 2025 is a more muted compound average growth rate of 4% compared to 3.2% globally. So still a very strong growing sector. Moving on to the supply side, Drury is predicting that the container ship fleet growth will lag behind demand growth this year and the next, but that the story will flip from 2023 onwards as recent orders start to be delivered. At the time of writing, this is mid-September 2021, the calendar year for 2021 contracting was 3.9 million TEU. With more than 3 months of the year remaining, this number is already well above the previous annual record of 3.3 million TEU, which was set in 2007. The anticipated mismatch between supply and demand from 2023 represents a risk to carriers of overcapacity returning to the market. Let's have a look at North American freight rates. So the rise in freight rates that took place during the third quarter of this year surprised everybody. Trans-Pacific eastbound spot freight levels went 5 to 6 times higher than their pre-COVID levels, while on the westbound leg, freight levels went only 3 to 4% higher. Freight rates have started softening in recent weeks, and evidence is growing that consumer spending is moderating. We don't publish freight rate forecasts by trade route, but here is our forecast for next year's global average freight rates. Firstly, though, our outlook for average freight rates for this year is now up 126% on 2020. Up from a 47% increase, which we were expecting in June. So this third quarter rate evolution has really taken everybody by surprise. For next year, we expect spot rates to decline. Indeed, they have started to come down in recent weeks, but there will be a significant increase in the contract pricing, leading to a further increase in the global average of about 6%. So the industry profit outlook. Most shipping companies are predicting higher than anticipated results for the second half of the year. And hence we at Drury have also upgraded our EBIT forecasts for the sector. We now expect the carrier industry to make EBIT in the region of 150 billion this year and 155 billion rather next year. Since January 2020, carriers have used these financial tailwinds primarily to strengthen their balance sheets. We were able to identify a total of $43 billion spent on debt repayments. However, the total cumulative debt of the sample group of 14 carriers, which stood at 73 billion at the end of June, was only 4 billion less than last year's. So lines have also opened up massive new credit lines. These are used for investments in core assets, the ships, containers, and terminal assets, as well as M&A activity predominantly aimed at expanding their logistics capabilities. That brings me to the end of my presentation, and I will now hand you back to Peter Friedman.
Thank you, Stein. Because of time, we're going to take some of these questions that come in. We're going to share them with you afterwards, and then we're going to have an opportunity after the webinar here for more dialogue through written and emails, and people will ask. But I want to thank you very much. It is a frightening situation with your data, which your data is demonstrating here, when the service providers are making more profit in a month than they were making in previous years, while the customers, their customers, the agriculture exporters, the retailers, are going out of business because of the practices of the ocean carriers and the freight rates that they're charged, and the demurrage and detention and all the rest of these charges. So in a way, we're sort of upside down here, and that's what we're grappling with. But Stein, thank you very much. You gave us the prediction. It'll be the end of December of next year when this starts to abate, December 2022, 2023, 2 years from now. Okay. 2 years from now, it'll start to abate. Okay. Then let me ask you, Paul, how are you going to survive?
Well, it's nice that I'm not alone in my suffering, and I completely agree with everything Stein has said. It was a very, very good presentation, very, very useful to see. And I totally agree that this is not a short-term fix at all, and we're looking at all of next year in terms of trying to get back on our feet. So I want to obviously start my presentation. My company represents largely North American exporters. We do imports as well, but my passion and my focus is serving the US export market. And I want to talk about some of the challenges that we're having both in and out of the country right now. If we can just move my slide over. Okay. So just a quick recap of where we are now. Global supply chain focused on Asia exports. This is nothing new. We have had this focus on Asia exports for at least 10 years, but with the recent pandemic and the changes in how the carriers are operating, it has now begun to obviously have an impact on our daily lives. And we're seeing what was already there, we're now seeing the daylight of that. Because of certain ports being very useful for the import cargo flows, what we're seeing is carriers deciding to omit ports and offer blank sailings from perfectly operating terminals in every country in the world. So this is not just North America. We are seeing this globally, that carriers are determining what ports they call in each country by the demand of import flow only, and the export cargo flows are being ignored. We have currently about 100 vessels, actually probably 111 vessels waiting at berth in the port of Long Beach, Los Angeles and San Pedro, the 3 terminals of Los Angeles. This is getting worse each day. We were down to a waiting time of about 8 days 2 months ago, and the waiting time for a berth now in the port of Los Angeles is up to 16.5 days. The carriers, despite this, want quicker container turnaround times, which is, in a way, it sounds almost contradictory, but they are looking for quick turns on the boxes and as many turns they can have during a year. And obviously maintaining schedule is very, very important to the carriers and very, very important to the supply chain. Due to needing to turn containers quicker, the carriers have looked at demurrage and detention and decided that they want to try and eliminate this or reduce this special free time agreements down to as little as possible. This makes a lot of sense with regards to world term times, but it's not always easy to manage business with certain ports and certain customs regulations within the demurrage and the free times that the carriers are actually offering. And this is causing a lot of additional revenue to the carriers, and of course impacting shippers and buyers, because we're paying a fortune in terms of demurrage and detention to try and move boxes that we're frankly having a problem moving off the quay. Okay. A lot of the free time and storage problems that we have are not actually North American generated. They are the buyers of the products that we ship to. And the bigger countries where this is a problem is the Middle East, India, Vietnam, those types of countries. If you're shipping boxes to an end user, the end user typically will take the box from the terminal very, very quickly. But if you're shipping containers through a trader or a speculator, then they have to wait for the market conditions to become favorable to pull the containers off the quay and sell the product in the markets. And because of this, they use free time as a storage bin, which of course impacts the whole globe. Equipment and chassis shortages are becoming a real problem in the United States. The chassis shortages in Oakland are, at breaking point. This is because the people that own the chassis and allow the chassis to be leased out are not replenishing the chassis, and we have a shortage of them. We are also having real issues with truckers being able to offload empties back to the terminal due to a lack of terminal capacity. So a lot of the chassis are being used by the truckers sitting in yards, and we're unable to return them so they can be used. Without a chassis, we're then reliant upon truckers that have their own wheels in order to move boxes around, and we're in short supply of those types of truckers. So the fact the chassis are being stuck is a real problem for the US exporter. Trucking shortages are also a real problem and have been for a long time as well. The average age of an American truck driver is 56. The young children in schools are not being encouraged to go and become truck drivers because we all believe we're going into electric trucks by 2035. So the younger generation are not being encouraged to become truck drivers. And really, I do sympathize greatly with the truckers because they are the lowest in the food chain in terms of revenue. They have the work that they have to do to perform the turns and the moves in and out of the port are extremely challenging. Some truckers wait all day to pick up an empty from a terminal. Sometimes they can't return the empties when they want to. Everything is appointment systems in the terminals, and getting in and out of the terminals is crippling their business. So the truckers are having probably the hardest time of all in terms of trying to maintain the supply chain. In addition to that, they're all also, due to environmental pressures, are basically being asked to change their engines twice in a period of 10 to 15 years, which, when you consider what the price of trucks are, this is a real big challenge and something that really needs to be further considered. Because although the environment is critical, we don't have enough truckers now. So to impose additional sanctions against them is only going to make our trucking issue worse until electric trucks are available to come in. Driver turnover is about 90% of all truck lines at the moment, meaning that they're not getting the equipment and they're not actually on the road trying to move the cargo. They're stuck in terminals waiting to move. Increased fuel is also a problem for the truckers. Fuel is up about 10%. It's a global problem. but again, impacting the truckers. And with the new ways to try and resolve the port congestion in Los Angeles, we've obviously heard that the terminals are open 24/7, but according to the Port of Los Angeles, only 50% of weekend appointments are being left open and used, and only 30% of evenings are being used. And this is because a lot of course, the warehouses and the manufacturers in the United States don't have workers that want to work through the night. Okay, we're having issues finding enough people to do the work anyway, and people don't want to work outside usual regular timeframes. We can move to the next slide. On the right-hand side, the WAVE report, the grey box is obviously the biggest concern for US exporters, because the grey box represents all the empties that the carriers are loading, and the dark blue is the actual full loads US export that's being loaded. So you can see there's a huge imbalance at the moment between empties and fulls being loaded, which is obviously not good for US exporters. So how did we get here? Well, first of all, we have a freight rate imbalance, which has already been touched upon. And we obviously are already still seeing that, where freight rates to China are a lot higher, from China to the USA are a lot higher than the USA to China. Okay, this has been the case for 10 years. A lot of the carriers have always seen the leg from the USA back to China as an empty repositioning exercise, but they've obviously now taken that to a new level and are purely just loading empties and ignoring the US export. Free time is being used as storage for buyers, as I've already touched upon. And the pandemic's impact, obviously we didn't have ships for about 3 months. We got behind, and due to this, we've never really got caught up. Extra household income, people forced to be at home through the pandemic, reevaluated their lives, had some disposable income because they weren't going on holiday, they weren't going to restaurants, they weren't going to bars. They looked around their house and said, I need to work on my house, and ordered stocks online because they couldn't go to the shops. And of course, this change in activity brought about a 39% e-commerce growth to the United States, and people have continued that path since the pandemic ended. We have 6 ports on the US West Coast, which are being underutilized and omitted completely, in my opinion, at the moment. This is a very, very important point that I'm going to get to at the end of my presentation. But at the moment, the carriers do want to keep going to Savannah and Los Angeles, and they do want to omit key ports such as Oakland and Seattle. The carriers' game plan to go into the port of Long Beach and Los Angeles, I just wanted to put on this slide that their efficiency is rated 333 out of 351 ports globally, source of routers. And obviously, all the ships go into a port which is struggling with efficiency is going to hold up the supply chain. We have an over-reliance on imports and no support for the US export market from carriers, and this is obviously in order to maximize carrier profits. The other thing that's important, of course, and was touched upon in the jury report, is that there's only 15 carriers in the world now. I would say that there is really only 3 systems, 3 alliances, and through my discussions with the carriers within those alliances, there is really only one decision maker within those alliances, and that is the person that has the biggest share of the alliance or has the vessel that is calling that week. So in many, many regards, all the supply chain decisions from the carrier side are being made by 3 people weekly and not any more than that. So it's a big, big issue. I think the carriers have gone from being a primary service industry, which we saw in the 70s, 80s and 90s, to a global money-making machine. Some carriers are controlled by banks, and it's becoming more of a faceless organization where we're just mandated on what we're going to suffer. And it's very, very difficult to fix anything because every carrier is heading in an automated direction. So what's next? Due to delays in cargo, what we're seeing is unreliable schedules for US exports. And that is leading US exporters to change the way that they have done business in the past, okay? We are seeing that US exporters are refusing to sell internationally at this time and are trying to sell their products domestically. There are obviously seasonality patterns in terms of cargo flows that are now shifting into different periods. The peak period of agricultural crop from the United States is usually October to December, but because of the delay in shipments, we are now seeing the peak season is estimated to be January to March of next year. One of the biggest problems I think that we face for 2022 is the future trucking problems. And what I think we will see, unfortunately, is that truck prices will continue to rise, and it is absolutely possible that truck prices could be higher than ocean freight prices in the near future. Okay, this is because of the mandates ahead and because the truck companies are having real issues in terms of moving between the ports, and we simply don't have enough of them. The other thing that I've noticed from my trade recently is that US truckers are refusing to take US export loads because they would prefer to deliver US import loads. There is hope on the horizon that we can obviously help ourselves with technology, terminal issues and appointments. There's potential solutions now for truckers to buy a program that will give them access to what terminals are open at any given time. And these types of programs will be very, very useful. They're retroactive, so we're going to have proof now if the carrier and the terminals were actually open and whether they were closed. And this is going to help with our investigations into demurrage and detention, which are crippling a lot of US exporters and importers at this time. And then at the bottom of the last slide, if we can just go back, I just want to, at the graph at the bottom, it shows the average seconds that it takes for a US container to get off a ship versus what it takes in Europe and Asia. And you can see that the efficiency of the US ports are not up to the rest of the world. If we go on to the next slide, and we talk a little bit about the solution. So the solution that we're led to believe in Los Angeles is that by opening up the terminals 24/7, that we'll be able to get through this very difficult period in front of us. But this 24/7 opening up of terminals only applies to a couple of terminals and not all 12 terminals on the US West Coast. It will free up 3,500 TEUs extra per week, but that really only represents about 1% of the total volume through the port, which is about 1.2 million TEUs per month. With 100 ships waiting outside the berth of Long Beach and Los Angeles, that's approximately 1.6 million TEUs that we have outside the terminal. 3,500 extra TEUs per week will take over a year to fix the current problem. So the estimated fix time based upon early October statistics is that it will take 57.5 weeks to deliver all the cargo which is sitting outside the port of Long Beach that we have today. Okay, and that is also taken into account. Carriers are going to continue to go to Long Beach and bring more ships. So 57.5 weeks to solve the current problem. And frankly speaking, I think that is outrageous and not good enough. So what is being offered to us is really a sprint towards Christmas to try and get some boxes through the terminal, but I don't think it's sufficient if we're really going to solve the problem. So how can we solve the problem? Well, my general feeling is for the 111 ships sitting outside the port of Long Beach, that the last 85 ships that have arrived need to be redeployed to other US ports that have cranes, that have workers, which have truckers and are available. We have San Diego, we have Port Miami, we have Tacoma, Seattle, and Oakland. All terminals are available, ready to work, and are underutilized today. And I don't understand why the carriers would all keep going to the port of Long Beach and Los Angeles and waiting 16+ days for a berth when they can redeploy those vessels in an adequate time frame and start offloading the ships and getting this product through the supply chain. Perhaps we need National Guard intervention, or perhaps we need a body that can oversee what is going on so that we can move boxes quicker through the ports. Resolving the container congestion issue will require many different areas to be involved in many different aspects of the public sector. I also want to talk a little bit about the empty depots. Since the terminal has told the carriers that after 9 days, they're going to start charging them for containers to sit on the quay, the reaction from the carriers of that is to pass all the fees on to the US importer so that they don't have to pay and worry about that. And suddenly the carriers have started to find offside locations outside the terminals and are now offering us the opportunity to bring empties back to those areas so that they will avoid the charges if the empty boxes sit on the quay for a long period of time. Now, these empty areas outside the terminal are very, very useful, and this is very, very good news. But what would be more useful is to allow these areas to stage US export cargo, where at the moment we're given a time frame of 1 or 2 days to deliver boxes, which is not sufficient. That would be perfect if we could take this time to load US exports, stage them by the terminals, and then just dray them over when the vessel comes in. I also would like to see, if possible, an environmental waste fee applied to empty boxes that are loaded by the carriers. Maybe this could be something that could be driven by the state or by the federal government, but for every empty we're reloading, there is an environmental fee attached to that, and we need to get a vested interest in US exporters again, and the only way we can do that is to stop the carriers reloading empty containers. And finally, I think the biggest point, the biggest question that I think we need to ask the carriers at this time is, what is the tipping point of how long the carriers are prepared to have ships wait in the ports before it becomes financially unviable for them? At the moment, we have waiting time in Los Angeles of 16 days. If it was 21 days waiting time or 28 days waiting time, and they, instead of moving 2 or 3 ships a month, they were only moving 1, would they want this to change as well? Because suddenly it wouldn't be financially viable for them. That's the end of my presentation, Peter.
Paul, that was exceptional. Very, very good. Really appreciate it. And no surprise that it was exceptional. You do a great job on these things. Let me go quickly in our last 2 minutes here before we finish this. I want you to know that there is some solutions. ONE is bringing in another ship and another service into Oakland. They were willing to listen to ag exporters and some importers to do so. There are some inland depots that are being developed. The AgTC put together a list of 64 solutions, some likely and some unlikely, all controversial. And we have challenges all over. Now, final question for all of us. Is the availability of ocean carriers and the freight rates that reflect the lack of capacity compared to the amount of demand for export and import cargo, is that being manipulated? In other words, are carriers blanking sailings in order to keep capacity availability down and freight rates up? That's an open question, but it is something that we are going to go back to Stein with Drury and ask that question, because we are seeing evidence of that in various places around the world. Paul, if you have a comment on that, we'll take a quick one.
The only thing I will say is we started to see the carriers started to lay vessels up during the Chinese New Year. This was happening every year for the last 3 years, and it did have a really big impact on freight rates from the United States. And what would happen is, obviously, they would hold all the vessels in China for a 3-week period over the Chinese New Year. And as a result of that, because we didn't have sailings from the USA, we saw the freight rate spike due to lack of services. So there was some evidence. Sorry, there was some evidence of that.
Good, thank you. We have promised our hosts that we are going to end precisely at 1:15 Pacific, 4:15 Eastern. I think they really have a hook. They really yank us if we're not. So I want to thank everybody for participating. Lorena, thank you.
I'm sorry to interrupt. We do have a minute or two. If Stein would be gracious enough to comment on that last question.
Oh, excellent. Excellent. That's great. We can always use the time. Stein, what do you think? Are the carriers blanking sailings or artificially keeping capacity down, rates up?
Well, the Drury view is they are not. The Drury view is they are merely the very fortunate winners in what is an utterly cruel lottery. I think, in a way, it is tested. Born testament by the fact that it's very easy to add, or in the context, it is relatively easy to add vessel capacity, to redeploy ships. It's much less easy to create terminal capacity. And so that's what we're seeing. I think the carriers have done what they can to provide extra capacity, and now it's a bullwhip, right? So for the carriers, I don't think. Well, the second point to make really is there has been an investigation, right, into uncompetitive behavior. I think partly by the FMC, which currently has found no real solid evidence.
Well, they haven't seemed to find any evidence since they were given authority to investigate in 1984. So I guess the ocean carriers are acting perfectly, continuously since 1984. Well, in any case, folks are experiencing some really challenging situation, not only with the freight rates, but the lack of dependability. If you have a service contract with an ocean carrier, too many times we are hearing that the ocean carriers are saying, well, you have still minimum quantity commitment, and so do we, but we're not going to carry it. However, you can go on the spot market and we will sell you a container there. I don't know if, Paul, you are finding that to be the case on the export side. It's certainly happening, I understand, on the import side.
But it's hard for me to answer that one.
Yeah, well, we asked the tough questions. But Stein, there's a lot of concern about sort of market manipulation. We heard it from Congressman Garamendi. He said 5 carriers, there may be 10 carriers, but as we heard from Paul, there's only 3 alliances, and he who has the ship.
Yeah,
outside.
I'm not going to say who I had conversations with, but I have had conversations with all the carriers. And there is definitely one alliance where two of the partners want to go to Oakland and one doesn't. And the one that doesn't is preventing the other two from going there, which is really, really interesting. And of course, that is on the basis that everybody's being truthful. I don't think they are deliberately manipulating the capacity. I think the evidence is there to say that they are definitely favoring imports into the United States. They have turned their back on the US export market. They would prefer to load empties instead of a US export box. And I think that that's really doing a disservice to the United States, because freight rates have gone up considerably on US exports, and the US exporter has shown that they are prepared to pay more money to get space. So I don't understand why we continue to ignore US exports and reload empties. And for me, to keep going to Los Angeles, which is a broken area, and continue to put the focus on that one port is obviously a big mistake. We have other ports that are available. We have truckers that are waiting for business in Oakland, Seattle, Portland. We have the same things going on in Houston too. There is truckers out there that are waiting for containers to arrive and are not being utilized.
I think when you have the decision makers for a company located thousands of miles away from the United States and not located here, as someone said, Los Angeles, Long Beach, Seattle, Savannah is another pin on the global map. And I think we would be well served if the decision makers at the corporate headquarters were still located, or at least some of them still located here in the United States. I think they would be much more sensitive to the situation. The White House is pushing this 24/7. We have had many discussions, including workshops such as this, but actual workshops with engagement, not just on the chat, which seems to be blowing up now, which is great. Everybody's engaged. But we have had it with ILWU and with the stevedores, some of the big terminal operators. And my understanding is if they could just open the terminals a couple hours earlier every day and 1 hour more in the evening, you won't get into this problem of people drivers having to work at 2 in.the morning, which, or even 11 at night, which they're reluctant to do. I see that we are joined now by Chuck. Does this an indication we're finished?
I think this is an indication you're finished, but it was a great presentation by both Paul and Stein, and of real interest and more than a bit depressing, I think, to all of us here. So we can only hope that they take some of the suggestions we've heard and act them, as well as the congressman. But thank you very much.
Thank
For your
you.
presentations, and thank you, Peter.
Thank you. And we are making the presentations available, and I'm hoping we can copy the chat, or somebody can store the chat, because we got a lot of input right in there. So thank you all. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Next, we will turn to our second sponsor raffle from Trade Data Monitor, and I'll turn it over to Kristen Stein from Trade Data Monitor.
Hi, I'm Kristen Stein from Trade Data Monitor. As many of you know, TDM supplies the official import and export merchandise trade data to USDA cooperators via our online portal. All cooperators have access to this monthly updated data published in both quantity and value. The trade data helps users identify global market share and helps in preparing your UES applications. TDM representatives are always available for customer service and to answer any trade data related questions. So please feel free to reach out to us. Today, I'm pleased to be raffling off wireless headphones. The winner can choose between Apple AirPods or an Android compatible product. Shayna, can you go ahead and spin the wheel for the winner of the TDM wireless headphones, please? Remember, you must be present to win. And when the name is called, Emily Kim. So Emily, if you're available, if you can enter your name in the chat, and we'll go ahead and acknowledge that. And one of the USAEDC members, here she is. So Emily, we'll be in touch with you to find out what type of wireless earpods you prefer. Thank you all. And if you do have any questions for TDM, please reach out to us. Enjoy the conference.
Thank you, Kristen.
You're welcome, Chuck.
Now, for the last session of the day is a pre-recorded presentation entitled "The New Path for Purchase in Food and Beverage" by two Euromonitor International staff, one of whom will be present at the end of the presentation to take any questions. So I'll let them to start the presentation, please.
Hi, everyone. My name is Michael Schaefer. I'm the global lead for food and beverage here at Euromonitor International. And I'm also joined by my colleague, Jared Corton.
Hi, everyone. Jared Corton, yep, Senior Industry Manager for Food Nutrition. Really excited to be with you here today.
And thanks, Jared. And so what we are going to be taking you through over the next 30 minutes is a presentation that we're calling "The New Path to Purchase in Food and Beverage." And we'll talk a lot about how new technologies like delivery, live streaming, e-commerce more generally, changing the way both consumers shop and changing the way new products are developed, changing the way that all of these things reach the market. Some of the key ideas that we'll be taking you through in this presentation, first and foremost, is this idea that everything starts with the smartphone. Increasingly, more and more consumer journeys in the food and drink space start on the smartphone, really becoming a permanent fixture of this industry, all across this industry. This in turn is creating new points of discovery. This idea of smartphone first shopping journeys are going to drive pretty major changes in terms of strategies, both from a marketing standpoint, but also, as we'll see, from a product innovation standpoint. And when we talk about innovation, more and more, what we're really talking about is data. The best innovation is going to grow from the best data. And a smartphone first path to purchase generates the most data of all, as we'll see. And we'll take you through all the different ways that is shaping strategy, shaping products. So to kick things off, I am going to talk a bit about this idea of where consumers shop, where the journey is taking place, how that is shifting. And if we're thinking specifically about food and drink, we want to talk about the smartphone, but you can't really talk about the smartphone and e-commerce without also talking about delivery, and increasingly third-party delivery. This idea of delivery almost becoming a utility that a wide range of outlets and suppliers can tap into, whether that's restaurants, ghost kitchens, grocery stores, convenience stores, even vending machines. We're talking more and more about dark stores as well. All of these increasingly are feeding into third-party delivery with shopping journeys that start on the smartphone. And so this can really blur the lines between these different concepts, not just in reality, not just in terms of what they actually look like and how they operate, but also in the minds of consumers. And that's a really important point to carry with you throughout this presentation. And I'll say it again. Smartphone first is really what we're talking about here. We're not just talking about delivery. That's very important, but there's a whole constellation of occasions and of shopping journeys that begin on the smartphone, and that includes takeaway, that includes pickup, that's click and collect, and delivery. So delivery is where we're seeing some of the most important changes, but it is not the whole universe. And through all of these smartphone first journeys, really important point is it's shifting where those points of impulse are going to be. So if we think about convenience stores, quick service restaurants, all of the ways that those channels evolve to allow consumers to reach consumers at that point of impulse at the checkout counter and what have you, a a lot of those occasions are moving to the smartphone, and that shifts the way that manufacturers, that retailers need to think about finding consumers. We have some good examples of that here. The first one comes from Coca-Cola. In Japan, many may know, there's a very well-developed vending machine market. You can find vending machines on almost every corner. Vending machines have been hit hard by COVID-19 because foot traffic is declining. Fewer people are in the office, fewer people walking around, leaving the house. That means fewer vending machine transactions. And what Coca-Cola has done is they've looked to incorporate their huge vending machine network into a smartphone app, giving you a subscription that is usable via the smartphone app. For a set fee, you get one beverage a day from any Coca-Cola vending machine. And so in a way, this remains a vending machine transaction, but it has become a smartphone first transaction, bringing with it data, bringing with it tracking, bringing with it rewards, a way to drive more use of these channels while using smartphones to start that journey. Another good example we have here, Unilever, looking to compete on delivery services like Uber Eats, like Deliveroo, and others. We often think of those as being about prepared food, but they don't have to be. Anyone can put a storefront up on Uber Eats, and what Unilever has done here is to put up its own storefront where you can bolt on any number of ice cream products to your order. And then Unilever takes care of delivery. Basically, they stock these products across a range of locations in a given city, usually convenience stores, petrol stations, and the like. And then when you make your order, the driver is routed to the nearest point of sale. And so all of that distribution is in the cloud. It's abstracted away from consumers. But it's a point of sale that, again, is smartphone first, with a lot of the data that entails, creating new opportunities through a new channel. And this isn't just about major CPG players, not at all. This idea of smartphone first, this idea of aggregating players via smartphones, we're also seeing this all across the world in what we call traditional channels. So thinking about those small mom and pop players that operate little bodegas or kirana shops in India, or spaza shops in South Africa, and so on. We're seeing big e-commerce players like Amazon, Alibaba, others looking to integrate these players, basically allowing people to make purchases on their smartphones, and then delivery is fulfilled by these players. So again, you see the smartphone incorporated into a wide range of different retail channels and different transaction types. So summing this up, this idea of first delivery on demand, but more broadly of smartphones as that first point in the journey, we're going to see new layers of commerce. We're going to see that smartphone become the abstraction layer where people interact with brands. This creates a number of different possibilities. It allows for more real-time production and testing. It's less about building all new outlets, more about creating new storefronts, new experiences on an app. It allows for a new product mix. Consumers are going to have different needs, different wants for a smartphone first transaction versus that kind of traditional impulse transaction you might see elsewhere. And then finally, that vast traditional retail and food service channel that we see all across the world is not going to be left behind. We're going to see big players integrating those channels. And so working in those channels, often a very profitable channel for many of the big CPG brands like Coca-Cola, Nestle, and others, will increasingly also become part of that e-commerce smartphone first ecosystem. So it really is everywhere. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jared to talk about how these changes to the consumer journey are also changing the way we shop, not just where we shop and when. So take it away, Jared.
Absolutely. Thanks, Michael. And yeah, I would echo that. I think that all of these changes, that idea of the smartphone providing a layer between the consumer and the path to purchase, will fundamentally change several elements of how consumers shop. The entire path to purchase will begin to change in some really significant ways. And so today we're going to dig into two of these in this section called How Consumers Shop. The two areas we're going to explore today and dive into in some detail is first social selling, and we're going to look at how streaming and live streaming and influencers really can change what brand storytelling looks like in food and beverage. Then we'll turn to this idea of commerce ecosystems and the rapid adoption of some of these new models and what that means for the future of data and innovation and new product discovery. But first, let's talk about social selling. In case you're not familiar, social selling is this idea of somebody promoting or selling a product online. Influencers doing this through a retail website, through their own social media platform. A significant portion of this is actually live streaming, in which somebody in real time jumps on a video and is explaining why this product is so sustainable or unique or why you should buy this product, sort of like the new era of the HSN and QVC home shopping elements of the world here. And what's really important here when we think about what these influencers mean, what these new social selling or live streaming models look like, is it's creating entirely new frontiers in what storytelling looks like in food. We think about the pandemic, right, and how that created sort of the perfect storm for this shift. On one hand, you had people who were starving for experience with their food. They couldn't go to restaurants, they were closed. They couldn't go out to eat. They couldn't, visit that new sort of foodie establishment. So their phones became their way of engaging and interacting and enjoying that foodie culture through live streaming, through influencers, through digital means. On the other hand, you had chefs who had closed restaurants and couldn't use their skills and make a living and express themselves through food. Many of those turned to these influencer type channels and began live streaming, cooking edition real time, explaining to their customers why this product was so unique and so why they should buy that product. And so this idea of the pandemic turning everything through the smartphone led to a significant boom in this idea of live streaming and social selling in food. And we look at where this is happening. We asked consumers in our global digital consumer survey, have you used live stream selling in the past year? And there's two really, really interesting results that pop here from this chart. The first is the massive chasm by age, right? When you go sort of below that age 44 threshold, we see very, very high levels of respondents, right? 35, 40% of people saying, yeah, I've used live streaming. You get older than that, and that number drops at this massive, 20 percentage point difference there by age. We also see a massive gap by market type, right, where this model is particularly pronounced in emerging markets. And if you were to look at respondents in markets like China, India, and Indonesia, you would see very, very high levels of consumers who say, yeah, I use live stream selling all the time. It's my go-to model for learning about new products and for shopping online. And so this shows not only the potential of what emerging markets might look like in the next 5 to 10 years, but it also shows where developed markets might get to as we move into this model more and more in the future. And so when you think about the future of social selling, we see that the environment is really ripe for the continued development of this model. First of all, the underlying medium continues to boom, right? TikTok, their CAGR in their monthly active user base grew by 260%. Again, that's a CAGR. So that's every year, that's grown by somewhere in that range of 260%. They now have over 500 million users globally using the TikTok platform. So more people are getting onto these platforms. The driver here is trust. We asked consumers, how do you view social media influencers? And nearly 44% of respondents in emerging markets say, I see them as very or extremely trustworthy. That number is like 15 percentage points higher than in developed markets. And it really is that response that says, I trust these people. These people, as they tell the story, they're relatable. I'm watching, I can understand it, and I have that high degree of trust in this model. And then finally, the advantage here, in terms of we ask consumers, why do you use live stream selling or live stream buying? They say it's easier to understand the product, right? Someone explaining it to me in real time is very helpful for me in understanding why I should buy that product. And this is why I think this model has so much potential in food and beverage in particular. We asked consumers, which categories have you purchased through live stream selling? And you can see right up there at the top with apparel, beauty products, which you would expect to be high on this list, is food. Food and beverage was the #2 response, followed by restaurant food, takeaway and delivery at #4. This is because you can tell really good stories with food. Food is this whole culture, the foodie culture is designed around telling stories and experiential dynamics. And that's why this model is so poised for success, I think, in the food and beverage market, is this element of storytelling and experiential dynamics that come with live streaming and social selling. Again, if you want to look at what's possible here, you look at China, right? China is leading on this space in many different ways. The example here is Pinduoduo, a major online grocer in the Chinese market. In fact, they sold nearly $42 billion in agricultural food products last year, and their goal over the next 5 years is to reach 145 billion and to become the world's largest grocer, I think is their overall mantra. But a big part of this is, Duo Live, where farmers can jump on their phone out in their fields and explain again why their products are so unique or so sustainable, telling those really powerful stories. They've developed a Duo University where consumers can go, or farmers can go and learn how to sell online and how to tell these stories and how to live stream. Taobao Live is another massive platform where, again, farmers in droves went on during the pandemic and were selling their products directly to the consumer in this new sort of model that relies on social selling, it relies on live streaming, and it represents a really significant shift in the consumer path to purchase in the coming years. The second element I want to talk about here is this idea of new commerce ecosystems, which have really surged during the pandemic. The first of these I'm calling paid memberships. And this is a model where consumers pay an upfront fee for access to exclusive discounts, free shipping, additional perks. The best in class example, of course, here is Amazon Prime. There's now 200+ million Amazon Prime members worldwide. But what really happened during the pandemic, not only did Prime continue to grow, but we saw a surge in other retailers and other food providers offering this type of model. Players like Uber Eats Pass or Dash Pass saw tremendous growth. In the retail space, we've seen Walmart Plus and Giant Choice Pass and Hy-Vee Plus and Albertsons Fresh Pass. I think Kroger just launched one last week with this idea of a paid membership. I pay an upfront fee, then I get unlimited access to free shipping, additional discounts throughout the year, fuel perks, and in the case of Amazon Prime Video and all these other benefits that come with that paid membership. The second model that I'm looping into this grouping here is called super apps. And these are apps that combine many different services, kind of like a paid membership, but they pull it all into a single app platform with payment serving as sort of the glue that holds it together. If you need the sort of best in class example of a super app, it's WeChat in China with over 1.2 billion active users. But we're seeing these spring up all over emerging markets, whether it's Grab in Southeast Asia or Rappi in Latin America or Jumia in Africa. This idea where consumers can get all of their life's needs through this platform, whether it's going on a social platform, whether it's buying something, whether it's hailing a taxi, everything goes through that platform with the mobile payments holding it together. And so you start to see these ecosystems, right? Paid memberships and super apps. And what's really important here, and there's really two interesting dynamics, is the gravity of these ecosystems and how they attract an ever-growing number of our transactions. If we were to think about everything we buy, right, as one of the little dots on this screen, think about this as your full transaction universe. What we see is that a lot of these ecosystems are expanding in a way to capture a bigger and bigger and bigger part of that total transaction universe. So if you look at paid memberships, right, if this bubble represented all of the transactions that were going into your paid membership, what we see is that these memberships tend to expand and grow over time. Think about Amazon, right? The idea of Prime Video. Amazon just bought MGM, right? The big movie producer from when I remember when I was young. It was the big movie producer. Now it's part of Amazon. They now own the rights to NFL games to broadcast those. Travel discounts, the Walmart gas discount. Insurance benefits, healthcare with Amazon buying PillPack. And what happens is as these memberships grow, they get bigger and bigger and they capture more and more and more of those transactions. And what happens there, in addition to growing, is these models become stickier. Once transactions fall into that universe, they tend to stick. Not only is there a sunk cost, right? I paid for that membership, and so I'm going to go back as many times as possible to get the benefit out of that paid membership. It's also just the idea that it encompasses so many different things, right? I watch Prime Video and I use PillPack and I stream James Bond and all these different elements that are part of the Amazon universe. It's much harder for me to leave because it takes up such an important portion of how I spend my time and what I do. And again, the best in class example here, if we really want to extrapolate and see what this could become, it's super apps. It's this idea that one provider, one platform encapsulates a huge portion of my transaction universe. When I go shopping, when I book travel, when I hail a taxi, when I give to charity, when I look for a loan, right? When I pay my utility bill, everything goes through that super app. And what happens is, they continue to get bigger and bigger and stickier over time. Now you might say, Jared, what's the big deal? Why does this matter for the future of food and for CPG? And I think this quote from Doug McMillon, the president and CEO of Walmart, really captures what we're talking about here. He says, over time, more and more of our customers will want Walmart Plus because it makes life better. That relationship will drive repeat business, hence sticky, right? Drive repeat business. And here's the key, provide data that enables us to serve them even better and be more personalized. Again, provide data is the key there. We will add more benefits to the membership to broaden its appeal. We're going to grow that bubble size bigger and bigger over time. Walmart Plus then unlocks data that we can use to serve up items for customers more effectively. This is why this is so powerful. As that bubble, as that commerce ecosystem grows bigger and bigger, the underlying data that can be captured by that ecosystem becomes incredibly powerful. And as that bubble gets bigger, it captures more data. And this can transform what I think the future of CPG will look like in some really important ways. So now we'll turn to a conclusion to tie together, this element of social selling, these ecosystems and data capture, as well as what Michael talked about with this mobile-first shopping environment, to pull together, what do we learn from this? What do we have to think about when we think about the future of the path to purchase in food and beverage? The first element of disruption here is in this idea of product discovery. I love the background picture here because I think this really encapsulates the old, right? Somebody walking up and down the aisles, looking at products, reading labels, seeing packages. That was the old model of product discovery. But this new path to purchase is going to change what this looks like in some really significant ways. The first, again, is the role of influencers, this whole idea of live streaming and social selling that we talked about, in that people will spend less time browsing shelves and more time reading, listening, or learning what their friends and other influencers think online. In our latest survey, there's a really interesting tipping point. We found that almost 46% of respondents considered their social media network as very or extremely trustworthy. That number for a brand's advertisements was at 42%. So at this point, we saw the tipping point where what a brand is saying in its own ads became less trustworthy than what my social media network is saying. And I think this represents a future in which influencers will have a major impact on product discovery. And Michael, I think will take you through the next point here.
Yeah, I think very much alongside that point about influencers, if influencers are among the first places that more and more new consumers are looking for information on products, mobile, as we said, on the smartphone is the first point in many of these journeys, in all of these journeys. And so we're seeing more and more of the phone becoming the place, not just where people purchase, but where they do the research, where they understand how these products work, figuring all of that out, even when they're in the store. I think that's a really important point, that the smartphone is going to be a point in the journey, and often the first point in the journey, wherever that ends up. And I think that's really key to understanding all the trends that Jared and I are talking about today.
Yeah. And then finally, I think data-led is a really important takeaway here. Again, we talked about how those ecosystems are generating more and more of this data that is richer and richer on what we watch and what we buy, and the types of things that we're interested in. And remember, one of Amazon's big selling points, and even thinking about Netflix, the idea is that they can use all of your purchase history, all of your viewing history to recommend future titles or products. They say, based on everything you watch and buy and where you go and what you do, this is the product we think will really fit your needs. And so when we think about, as this data becomes richer and richer over time, the idea of algorithms helping us make data-led decisions on new products to try. You know, rather than me going and browsing for an hour to find something, I will rely on that underlying data to feed up a recommendation, and that will drive my product discovery process. So data is telling me what I should try next based on my history. And we have seen an increase. We now have 44% of respondents saying, yeah, I will share data in order to receive personalized and targeted offers and deals. As long as you're using my data to improve my life, right, to make the best product recommendations for me, that's fine. And consumers are becoming more and more open to that. That number has grown over time. And then the other element besides product discovery that we want to talk about here is that this new path to purchase will transform the fundamental process of innovation in some really significant ways. We ended the last section talking about data. I think we need to start this one talking about data as well. The idea that innovation will become increasingly driven by this underlying data that's generated in this new digital world. I like to contrast this with the traditional focus group. It used to take a really long time. You had to bring in a lot of different consumers, spend a lot of money, and a relatively small sample just to get what people were thinking. Nowadays, when you have this world of online commerce and social media influencers and social media more generally, it's very easy to innovate off of that data versus based on a focus group, and it can be done much faster on much larger sample sizes, and these rollouts can be done locally or to specific consumer bases. We like to talk about this idea of personalized nutrition. It's been something we've talked about for years, to be honest, in terms of the future of what personalized nutrition might look like. Well, again, it becomes more possible or more of a potential reality as the data on your eating habits or your dietary concerns or your nutritional profile, as that continues to evolve. This idea of fully customized, fully personalized products delivered to specific people, again, driven on the data, becomes increasingly possible. So I think we will see data-driven innovation continue to move that needle faster and more streamlined innovation in that way.
Yeah, in addition to that, it's also going to create new models of driving innovation. I think if the old paradigm that Jared and I have been talking about was all about foot traffic, you know, meeting consumers where the foot traffic is, here we do need to think about data traffic. You know, how do you, where are the points of contact with the consumer along the consumer journey that can supply that data? You know, where are our smartphones taking us? And so we're seeing already some interesting examples of things like coffee manufacturers creating smart machines that work with an app to better understand how you like your coffee, what variations you like, which is an enormous amount of data on usage, when, where, how we're drinking our coffee, which in turn can become part of that feedback loop to create new products. And so going forward, we're going to see a lot of new business models that use the term flywheel, perhaps excessively, but the idea being, how can we create as many positive feedback loops of data driving new innovation, driving new usage, which drives in turn more data.
Yeah. And then finally, I think there's something to be said about the role of physical appearance. We think back to the prior slide, the old model of product discovery, right? Of people browsing shelves and looking at end caps. A significant part of traditional innovation budgets came down to the physical appearance of the product, how the product actually looked on the shelf, whether that's packaging innovations, the actual color of the product itself, the transparent windows, all of that budget that has been dedicated to physical appearance innovation over time. That's going to become less important in the future when, as Michael's talked about, a huge part of our shopping journey goes through a 5.3-inch mobile screen. When I'm scrolling through a list of products online and doing online shopping, I often can't even see what the package looks like. It's a tiny little thumbnail picture, and the only way I'd see it is if I double click and I scroll in to try to view the package, and there's just not a realistic way for how people shop through their smartphones. And so this idea that physical appearance was a major area of spend when it came to innovation budgets, I think that is going to become less important in the coming decade. And more of that innovation around areas like packaging will focus on functionality, will focus on sustainability, will focus on product performance. That will drive more and more of what our innovation budgets look like, again, as the shopper journey transitions from browsing on the stores, looking at what pops on the shelf, to looking at my smartphone, reading reviews and having people tell me about why this product is so unique, why I should buy this product based on superior performance or sustainability credentials or whatever there. So I think that's a really important point that we need to think about when it comes to the future of how we spend our innovation budgets moving forward. With that, we'd like to thank everyone for joining the presentation. Hopefully you learned something today and had some interesting takeaways. We do have a few minutes for question and answer now, so we'd welcome any questions that may come in. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you to both of you and Michael, who is here in person. Are there any questions on this really thought-provoking presentation? Okay, something just came in. The selling space is so exciting. As MAP participants, we need to have performance measures associated with our constraints and activities. Ideally, these performance measures include the value of the products sold. We have found that the e-commerce platforms are reluctant to share these data, as the data is a product. How do we get access to this data?
I think that's a really good question, and I think I would go farther and say I think it is the central question when thinking about e-commerce. A lot of the examples in that presentation that we just saw involved some of the ways the companies are trying to build out those portals. So I think that's why we're seeing so many companies experimenting, so many brands experimenting with creating their own apps, with creating their own points of contact with the consumer. So that could be anything from, branded retail shops to vending machines to branded machines that can capture that data. Even if the vast majority of your business is going to be through e-commerce, we're seeing a lot of product manufacturers that are experimenting with even fairly small DTC, direct to consumer businesses, just to drive some of that data acquisition. I think that can be a big part of it on the brand side, for sure. But there's no question that, this is an ongoing point of tension, because as you say, I mean, the e-commerce players very much see this as their product. And so I think we're going to we see it in the restaurant space all the time, more players coming to the fore, thinking about ways to create some of those points of data. So thanks for that question.
One more question here. With the eventual elimination of plastic for packaging and labeling, what would it be your suggestion on how to communicate to consumers and brand recognition?
Sure. I mean, I think from a packaging standpoint, I think that last point that Jared made, I think is really salient here, where packaging over time could become less about creating that effective block on the shelves or creating that effective billboard that we think about, or being able to stack products to the ceiling, and more about creating an experience that lasts, when that product arrives at your door. You might be ordering it off of your phone, you might be doing click and collect, you're just not interacting with it on the shelves in the way that you did before. And so, in that case, the materials is, whatever material you're using, the important point is, how is that product that is staying, on the shelf, how is that communicating meaning? How is that communicating experience? How does it feel in your hand? I think we're going to see, quite a bit more experimentation there. And also just defining things like premium. What is a premium product if you don't have as much access to those end caps or those special displays in a store that might help to drive some of that experience? And that's where more packaging investments, I think, can come into play.
Well, thank you. I believe that was the last question, and I think now you're going to introduce your colleague Devora to do the last raffle of today.
That's right. Yes, I do have the honor of introducing my colleague Devora Kaufman, who will be introducing, I think, the last raffle of the day.
Great. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Michael. And thank you again to Jared and Michael for that insightful presentation. Really gives us a lot to think about when we think about promoting agricultural products, especially in some of these other markets outside the US. As Michael mentioned, I'm Devorah Kaufman, and Patty LaGuire and I are your Euromonitor International Account team. We are thrilled to continue as Platinum sponsor for this year's annual workshop and to provide these two fabulous prizes to the lucky winners: an Apple Watch today and tomorrow a Sonos Bluetooth speaker. As your partners, we aim to ensure that you have the data, analysis, and global strategic information you need to understand and prioritize opportunities for export expansion. And now I think we're ready to spin the wheel. Shana, can we spin the wheel? Okay, and the winner is Christian. Chris, if you are here, please send us a message in the chat box that you are here, so we know and we can give you that, arrange the wonderful prize. And if you're not here, oh, you are here. Wonderful. Congratulations, Chris. Okay, thank you. And now back to Chuck for some final announcements.
Thank you very much, Devorah. That's it for today. Thank you for joining us. And just a reminder that the presentations and other resources are available in the mobile app. Once again, a big thank you to our sponsors, Euromonitor, Trade Data Monitor, Brian Christie, and Rose Research. Be sure to return tomorrow for more great content and additional raffle drawings. The session tomorrow will begin promptly at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time with the FAS update. We will see you then and have a good evening. Thank you.